Frontier War, a wild Western action-adventure. Chapter 1. The morning Jack Hays would remember for the rest of his days started quiet as church on the Guadalupe River, mist rising off the water like the breath of ghosts. He sat his horse on the ridge above the cottonwoods, watching his 8 rangers water their mounts in the shallows below. Good men, everyone. Weathered and reliable as old leather. "Captain," called out Sergeant Tom Gilliland, his voice carrying up from the riverbank. "Found fresh sign. Unshod ponies, maybe 20 head, crossed here yesterday evening." Hays touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, but kept scanning the brush line across the water. Something felt wrong. The birds had gone quiet 10 minutes ago, and his horse kept flicking her ears at sounds he couldn't hear. 23 years on this earth, 5 of them ranging the Texas frontier, and he'd learned to trust the prickle between his shoulder blades. "Mount up," he called down. "We're moving." "Hell, Captain," said Billy McCulloch, the youngest of his men at 19, still green enough to argue. "The horses ain't had their fill yet. They'll drink later." Hays pulled his single-shot rifle from its scabbard and checked the percussion cap. "Or they won't drink at all." The Rangers knew that tone. They climbed into their saddles without another word. 8 men in buckskin and homespun, armed with rifles, pistols, and knives. Good enough weapons for white men, fighting white men. But the Comanche weren't white men. And they didn't fight like any enemy Hays had faced in his years soldiering against the Cherokee up in Arkansas. They rode single file through the mesquite and prickly pear, following the Indian trail that wound northeast toward the settlements. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and heating the air until sweat darkened their shirt backs. Hays kept them moving at a steady walk, his eyes never still, reading the country like scripture. That's when he saw the ravens. A dozen black birds circled lazy over a draw half a mile ahead, the kind of patient circling that meant something dead waited below. Hays raised his fist and the column stopped. He studied the ground, the sky, the way the wind moved through the grass. "Could be a deer," whispered Gilliland, riding up beside him. Could be. But Hays's gut said otherwise. He'd seen too many Comanche tricks, too many rangers who died thinking they were chasing game sign when they were being led into a trap. "Billy, you and Rodriguez circle wide to the left. Rest of you spread out. If it's Comanche, they'll hit us when we reach that draw." They'd covered maybe 50 yards when the world exploded. The war cry rose from 100 throats at once, high and wild and full of blood promise. Painted warriors burst from every piece of cover Hays had thought was empty, from behind rocks, from creek beds, from mesquite thickets that had looked too thin to hide a jackrabbit. They came on horseback, 20, 30, 40 of them, feathers and scalp locks streaming, lances bright in the morning sun. "Form up," Hays shouted, but it was too late for formations. The Comanche had learned white man tactics, learned them well enough to use them better than the white men themselves. Rodriguez died first, a lance through his chest before he could raise his rifle. The impact lifted him clean out of his saddle and slammed him into the hardpan earth with a sound like a side of beef hitting a butcher's block. His horse screamed and bolted, stirrups flapping. Billy McCulloch got his rifle up, got off one shot that took a warrior's pony in the chest. The Indian rolled free as his mount went down, came up running with a tomahawk in each hand. Billy was still trying to reload when the first hawk took him in the skull. Hays fired, watched a warrior spin off his horse with a .50 caliber ball through his shoulder. Then he threw the empty rifle aside and drew his single-shot pistol, knowing it would buy him maybe one more heartbeat before they swarmed him under. Gilliland stood in his stirrups, rifle to his shoulder, and put a ball through a Comanche's belly. The warrior kept coming, blood streaming down his painted chest, and buried a knife between the sergeant's ribs. They went down together, in a tangle of limbs and fury. Johnson and Pierce tried to make a run for it, spurring their horses toward a gap in the circle of death. 3 warriors rode them down like wolves running deer. The last Hayes saw of them, they were on the ground screaming while Comanche knives went to work. Murphy lasted longer. The old Irishman had a brace of pistols and knew how to use them. He dropped 2 warriors before they got close enough to touch him. But a Comanche lance took his horse, and when Murphy hit the ground, he hit hard. Still game, he rolled to his feet with a knife in his hand. They let him stand there for a moment, this white-bearded old wolf with his back to a boulder, blade ready. Then they closed in from 3 sides at once. The whole fight lasted maybe 3 minutes. Hayes found himself ringed by a dozen mounted warriors, their horses dancing, lances and tomahawks ready. His pistol was empty, his knife still in its sheath. The smart play was surrender, hope they wanted him alive for the slow treatment back at their camp. But Jack Hayes had never been accused of being smart. He slapped spurs to his mare and charged straight at the biggest warrior, a scarred giant with a buffalo horn headdress and human scalps hanging from his belt. The Comanche's eyes went wide. This wasn't how white men were supposed to behave, and his horse shied sideways just enough for Hayes to break through. Then he was riding for his life across the broken country, bent low over his mare's neck while arrows whined past his ears. One shaft punched through the cantle of his saddle, another grazed his shoulder blade, tearing cloth and skin. His horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole, recovered, stumbled again. Behind him, the war cries faded as the warriors stopped to scalp the dead and count coups. They'd won their victory. Let this one white man run. Let him carry word back to the settlements of what happened to rangers who rode into Comanche country. Hayes didn't look back until he'd put 2 miles between himself and the killing ground. When he finally turned in his saddle, he could see smoke rising from the draw where his men lay dead. The Comanche were burning something. Maybe the bodies. Maybe just celebrating. His mare was done, foam on her muzzle, her sides heaving like bellows. He'd have to walk her the rest of the way to San Antonio, assuming the Comanche didn't change their minds about letting him live. 8 good men dead in 3 minutes. 8 rangers who trusted him to read the signs right, to keep them alive in a country that killed the careless and the unlucky with equal enthusiasm. Hayes touched the arrow shaft still protruding from his saddle, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not fear, he'd burned through that back at the river. This was something else. Something that tasted like iron and ashes. The Comanche had won this fight with numbers and surprise, and the kind of mounted tactics that made single-shot weapons about as useful as throwing rocks. But wars weren't won with single battles, and Jack Hayes was still breathing. He'd heard stories from back east, rumors of a new kind of pistol that could fire multiple shots without reloading. Something a Connecticut Yankee named Colt was making up in his factory. Most folks called it impossible, too good to be true. Hayes touched the blood on his shoulder and looked back one more time at the smoke rising from his dead. If such a weapon existed, he meant to find it. And then, he meant to teach the Comanche what impossible looked like. Chapter 2. Jack Hayes limped into San Antonio 3 days later, looking like something a coyote had worried and left for dead. His shirt hung in blood-crusted tatters, his left shoulder ached like a bad tooth, and his mare moved with the careful gait of a horse that had given everything she had and then some more. The plaza buzzed with afternoon commerce. Mexican vendors hawking chilies and corn, teamsters cursing their oxen, women and rebozos carrying water jugs on their heads. Nobody looked twice at another broken-down ranger riding in from the chaparral. In Texas, that was Tuesday. Hayes dismounted in front of Nora's tavern and nearly went down when his knees buckled. He caught himself against the hitching post, stood there breathing hard while black spots danced in front of his eyes. The mare drooped her head and stood spraddle-legged, done. "Sweet Jesus," came a woman's voice from the tavern doorway. "Jack Hayes, what happened to you?" Nora Vance stepped into the sunlight, and for a moment Hayes forgot about the pain in his shoulder, forgot about Rodriguez's dead eyes staring at the sky, forgot about everything except the way worry creased her face. She wore a blue calico dress that brought out her eyes, her dark hair pinned up the way he liked it, showing the curve of her neck. "Had a disagreement with some Comanche," he said. "They won the argument. Your men? Dead. All of them." Nora's face went pale. She'd known those rangers, had served them whiskey and beans and listened to their tall tales. Good men with wives and sweethearts, and mothers who'd never see them again. "Come inside," she said, "before you fall down and give the Mexicans something to laugh about." The tavern smelled of wood smoke and tallow candles, and the kind of honest sweat that came from hard work, not fear. A dozen men sat at rough tables, nursing drinks and talking in low voices. Teamsters mostly, with a few soldiers from the garrison, and one or two men whose business was better left unasked. Nora guided Hayes to a table in the back corner, her hand firm on his good arm. "Sit. I'll get water and bandages." "Whiskey first." "Water and bandages. Whiskey after." "Don't argue with me, Captain Hayes. Not today." She disappeared into the back room, leaving Hayes alone with his thoughts and the low murmur of conversation from the other tables. He closed his eyes and saw Rodriguez die again, saw Billy McCulloch's skull cave in under the tomahawk, saw Murphy make his last stand with nothing but a knife and the kind of courage that got good men killed. "Capitan." Hayes opened his eyes. A Mexican in a threadbare cavalry uniform stood beside his table, swaying slightly. The man's face was stubbled and flushed, his eyes red-rimmed from drink. A deserter, by the look of him, probably from one of the border garrisons. "I know you," the Mexican said in accented English. "You are the ranger captain, see? The one who hunts Comanche." "Was." Hayes studied the man's uniform. Corporal stripes, but the brass was tarnished and one epaulette hung by a thread. "Looks like you've done some hunting yourself, Corporal." "Sargento," the man corrected, straightening with drunken dignity. "Sargento Luis Morales, late of the garrison at Presidio del Rio Grande. And you are correct, I hunt no more. The army, she pays in promises and feeds us beans full of weevils. A man can starve on such generosity. So you came north. See, to this place where a man might make his fortune." Morales laughed bitterly. "But fortune, she is a whore who smiles at other men." Nora returned with a basin of water and strips of clean cloth. She set them on the table and began cutting away Hayes's ruined shirt, her movements gentle but efficient. The arrow had left a shallow furrow across his shoulder blade, ugly but not deep. "This will sting," she warned, dabbing at the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth. Hayes hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. The Mexican watched with professional interest. "You were lucky, Capitan. The arrow, she just kissed you. A little more to the right." Morales shrugged expressively. "Didn't feel lucky at the time." "Luck, she is relative. You live, your men die. This is luck of a sort, no?" Nora's hand stilled. "That's enough," she said quietly. But Morales was drunk and past caring about proprieties. "I know something of luck, Capitan. And of fortunes that slip through the fingers like water." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of mezcal and broken dreams. "You fight the Comanche with single-shot rifles, see? Like fighting El Diablo with a stick. But what if I tell you there are better weapons? Weapons that fire 6 times without reloading." Hayes went very still. "I'd say you've been drinking too much mezcal." "Perhaps. But perhaps not." Morales glanced around the tavern, then lowered his voice. "In Galveston, there is a warehouse. Property of the Texas Navy, or was, before they disbanded the Navy and left everything to rot in the salt air. What kind of warehouse? The kind filled with devil guns. Pistols that fire 6 shots, one after another, faster than a man can count. Colts, they call them, after the Yankee who makes them. Nora's hands had stopped their ministrations entirely. She stared at the Mexican with the kind of expression a woman might wear watching a snake coil to strike. "How do you know this?" Hayes asked. "Because I was there, amigo. 2 years ago, when the Navy still existed and had money to spend on such toys. I helped unload the boxes from the ship. 20 pistols, maybe more, and ammunition enough to fight a war." "And they're still there?" Morales shrugged. "The Navy, she is gone. The warehouse, she remains. Guarded, see, but not by honest soldiers. By men who trade with Comancheros, who sell guns to whoever pays the most silver." Comancheros. Hayes spat the word like something foul. The mixed-blood traders were worse than the Comanche themselves, selling weapons and ammunition to raiders who used them against Texas settlements. See, they know of the guns, but have not moved them yet. Too many eyes watching, too much risk. But for a man with sufficient cojones. Morales spread his hands. Nora's voice cut through the conversation like a cold wind. "Don't." Both men looked at her. She was staring at Hayes with eyes that held too much knowledge of frontier violence, too many memories of men who'd ridden out full of plans and come back over a saddle. "Don't even think about it, Jack." "Nora. 8 men dead. 8 good men who followed you into hell because they trusted you to bring them home." Her voice was steady, but Hayes could see the tremor in her hands. "Isn't that enough blood for 1 week? It's not about. It's about revenge. It's about you riding off to get yourself killed because you can't live with losing a fight." The tavern had gone quiet. Conversations died as men turned to watch the drama playing out in the corner. Hayes felt heat rise in his face, felt the familiar anger that came when someone tried to tell a ranger how to do his job. "Those weren't just my men," he said quietly. "They were friends." Billy McCulloch was 19 years old. Had a sweetheart back in Gonzales, who was waiting for him to make enough money to buy a farm. And now she'll wait forever. Because I didn't have the right weapons to keep him alive. Nora leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "So you'll go to Galveston and steal some magical guns, and somehow that will bring Billy back. That will make Rodriguez breathe again? It'll keep other boys from dying the same way. Or it'll get you killed trying to steal weapons from men who'd cut your throat for the coins in your pocket." Morales cleared his throat delicately. "Perhaps I should." "Sit down," Hayes said without looking at him. "We're not done talking." The Mexican sat, understanding that he'd stumbled into something bigger than a simple business proposition. These two had history, the kind that involved promises made and broken, words spoken in passion and regretted in daylight. "Jack." Nora's voice was softer now, pleading. "Stay. Help me run the tavern. We could make a life here, a good life. No more ranging, no more chasing ghosts across the chaparral. You know I can't do that." "Can't or won't." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching the way afternoon light slanted through the tavern's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the plaza, vendors calling their wares, children laughing, the creak of ox cart wheels. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. Lives that would end in screaming terror if the Comanche decided to raid San Antonio. "Those weapons," he said to Morales. "How well guarded?" The Mexican's eyes brightened. "Not so well as they should be. 10 men, perhaps 12. But they are armed, and they are not fools." "Any rangers among them?" "I think not. Tejanos mostly, with maybe one or two Americanos. Men who fight for money, not for honor. Nora stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I won't listen to this. She walked away without another word, disappearing into the back room where she kept her private quarters. Hayes started to follow, then stopped. She was right to be angry. 8 men had died under his command, and here he was planning another fool's errand that would likely end the same way. But those Colt pistols were real. If half of what he'd heard was true, they could change everything. Give Rangers the firepower to match Comanche mobility. Level the playing field in a war that had been stacked against white settlers since the first cabin was built west of the Colorado. Tell me about this warehouse, he said to Morales. The Mexican smiled and signaled for another drink. Chapter 3. Captain Samuel Walker looked like a man who'd been carved from hardwood and weathered by 40 years of frontier sun. He sat across from Hayes in the back room of Mueller's General Store, his scarred hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Between them on the rough plank table lay a hand-drawn map of Galveston Bay, marked with shipping channels and warehouse locations. You're talking about stealing from the Republic of Texas, Walker said. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by human foolishness. The Republic that disbanded the Navy and left those guns to rust. Hayes traced a finger along the map's coastline. Hell, Sam, they've probably forgotten those Colts exist. Maybe. Or maybe they're saving them for something special. Walker's gray eyes studied Hayes across the table. Like arming Rangers who've lost their damn minds. Outside Mueller's store, San Antonio's evening commerce continued its familiar rhythm. Ox carts creaked past loaded with cotton bales bound for the coast. Vaqueros drove small herds of longhorns through the plaza, their spurs jingling like distant church bells. Normal sounds of a normal town that had no idea 2 Rangers were planning to steal military weapons from under the noses of Comanchero gunrunners. Those weapons could change everything, Hayes said. You know what we're up against out there. Single-shot rifles against mounted warriors who can put 6 arrows in the air before we can reload. I know what you're up against. Question is whether you do. Walker leaned forward, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. Luis Morales isn't the only one who knows about that warehouse. Word's been spreading through the cantinas like wildfire. Every cutthroat and fortune hunter between here and the Gulf has heard the story by now. All the more reason to move fast. All the more reason to think twice before riding into a hornet's nest. Walker pulled a leather pouch from his coat and dumped its contents on the table. Silver coins, Mexican and American both, along with a few nuggets of California gold. This is what I've saved from 5 years of Ranger pay. Not much, but enough to buy a small spread up in East Texas. Raise some cattle. Maybe find a woman who doesn't mind cooking for a broken-down old soldier. Hayes stared at the money. What's your point, Sam? My point is, I'm 43 years old and tired of burying friends. Tired of chasing Comanche across country that wants to kill you just for being white. Tired of sleeping on the ground and eating beans from a can while politicians in Austin argue about whether Rangers deserve to be paid. So you're quitting. I'm thinking about it. Walker scooped the coins back into the pouch. But if those Colt pistols are real, if they're everything Morales claims, they could give us the edge we need to finish this war. Or they could get us all killed trying to steal them. The 2 men sat in silence, listening to the sounds of evening settling over San Antonio. Somewhere in the distance, a guitar played a melancholy Mexican ballad. Closer, a drunk was singing off-key in one of the cantinas. The smell of cooking fires drifted through the store's open windows, mixing wood smoke with the scent of roasting meat and chilies. Tell me about the guards, Walker said finally. Hayes spread out the notes he'd taken during his conversation with Morales. 10 to 12 men, maybe more. Mix of Mexican deserters and Texas drifters, all working for a man named Crane. Josiah Crane? You know him? Walker's expression soured. Know of him. Used to be a sergeant in the Texas Army until they caught him selling rifles to Mexican raiders. Spent 2 years in the Huntsville prison before he escaped during a yellow fever outbreak. Morales says he's got connections with the Comancheros. That'd be Crane's style. Always was better at making deals than fighting battles. Walker studied the map again. This warehouse, it's right on the waterfront? According to Morales. Old Navy storage facility, built to house supplies for the fleet. Stone construction, heavy doors, probably a guard or two on duty at all times. And the rest of Crane's men? Scattered around Galveston. Some working the docks, others running cons on travelers. But Morales thinks they could gather quick if there was trouble. Walker rubbed his jaw, thinking, we'd need more than just the two of us. I've been considering that. Good men are hard to find. Rangers we can trust are even harder. Walker's eyes narrowed. You're not thinking of recruiting from the local talent, are you? Might have to. This isn't the kind of job we can do with just honest men. Christ, Jack. Listen to yourself. You're talking about partnering with thieves and cutthroats to steal weapons from other thieves and cutthroats. I'm talking about getting the tools we need to keep Comanche from burning every settlement between here and the Brazos. The bell above Mueller's front door chimed, and both rangers fell silent. Heavy footsteps crossed the store's main floor, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of gun leather. After a moment, Old Man Mueller's voice called out. Store's closed, friend. Come back tomorrow. Looking for Captain Hayes, came the reply. The voice was young, nervous. Heard he might be here. Hayes and Walker exchanged glances. Walker's hand moved to rest on his pistol butt. Back here, Hayes called. A young man appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, trying to look older than his maybe 20 years. He wore clean clothes and good boots, but his face had the soft look of someone who'd never been hungry or shot at. Captain Hayes. I'm William Donovan. My father owns the hardware store on Commerce Street. I know your father. Good man. Hayes studied the boy's earnest face. What can I do for you, son? I want to join the Rangers. Walker snorted. Boy, the Rangers aren't taking applications right now. We're too busy getting killed. Donovan's jaw tightened. I heard about what happened at the Guadalupe. About your men. I want to help make it right. Making it right usually involves getting shot at, Hayes said. Sometimes worse. Your father know you're here? No, sir. He thinks I should stay in San Antonio, help run the store. But I didn't come to Texas to sell nails and horseshoes. What did you come to Texas to do? Same thing every man comes to Texas to do. Make something of myself. Build something that'll last. Walker leaned back in his chair. Building things and shooting Comanche are two different skills, boy. Maybe. But I can ride and shoot, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Being afraid would be smarter. Hayes folded the map and tucked it inside his coat. Afraid men live longer. But they don't live better. The simple conviction in Donovan's voice reminded Hayes uncomfortably of Billy McCulloch, full of dreams and sure the world would bend to his will if he just had enough courage. Billy was feeding buzzards now, his dreams scattered like dust across the chaparral. Go home, son, Hayes said. Help your father with the store. Find a nice girl and raise some children. Let other men do the dying. Donovan's face flushed. With respect, Captain, I didn't ask for your advice about my life. I asked to join the Rangers. And I'm telling you no. Because I'm too young? Because you're too soft. Walker's voice carried the hard edge of a man who'd buried too many young soldiers. This isn't a game, boy. It's not some adventure story from back east. It's blood and screaming and watching your friends die while you run for your life. I understand the risks. No, Hayes said quietly. You understand the words. The risks you won't understand until it's too late to matter. Donovan stood there for a moment, his hat crushed in his hands, the flush of anger fading from his cheeks. When he spoke again, his voice was steady. My older brother died at San Jacinto, killed fighting for Texas independence. My father always said he died for something bigger than himself, something worth the price. Your brother died fighting an army, Walker said. We're talking about fighting ghosts who can put an arrow through your eye from horseback at full gallop. Then maybe it's time someone evened the odds. Hayes felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. The boy had sand, no denying that. And they would need men for what he was planning, men who could ride and shoot and wouldn't run when the killing started. You ever steal anything, Donovan? The question seemed to catch the boy off guard. Sir, have you ever taken something that didn't belong to you? No, sir. My father raised me to be honest. Then you're no good to me. Hayes stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. What I'm planning isn't honest work. It's thievery, pure and simple. The kind of job that ends with good men in prison or dead. Donovan's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You're going after those guns. The ones the Mexican was talking about in the tavern. Walker cursed softly. Half the damn town heard that conversation. I can help, Donovan said quickly. I know Galveston. Spent 2 summers there, working in my uncle's shipping office. I know the docks, the warehouses, which guards can be bought, and which ones can't. Hayes studied the young man's face, looking for the soft spots that would break under pressure. What he saw instead was the same desperate determination he'd felt at 19, the same need to prove himself worthy of the name Texan. This isn't joining the Rangers, he said finally. This is something else entirely. Something that could get you hanged if we're caught. I understand. No, you don't. But maybe that's better. Hayes looked at Walker, who shrugged as if to say the decision was his to make. All right, boy. You want to help steal some guns? Donovan's grin was answer enough. Outside Mueller's store, the night sounds of San Antonio continued their familiar rhythm. But inside the back room, 3 men bent over a map and began planning something that would either change the course of the Indian Wars or get them all killed trying. Somewhere across town, in a tavern that smelled of wood smoke and broken dreams, Nora Vance served whiskey to teamsters and tried not to think about a ranger captain who chose duty over love every time the choice presented itself. Chapter 4. The Gulf wind carried the smell of salt and rotting fish through Galveston's narrow streets, mixing with wood smoke from the cooking fires and the sweet stench of molasses from the sugar warehouses. Hayes pulled his hat brim low and watched the docks from the shadow of a cotton broker's office, counting guards and timing their rounds. 3 days in the island city had taught him that Morales hadn't lied about much. The warehouse squatted at the end of Pier 7 like a stone toad, its windows barred and its single door guarded by 2 men who looked like they'd cut throats for drinking money. Navy property, according to the faded sign, but the Republic's Lone Star had been painted over with crude Spanish words that probably weren't compliments. Guard change coming up, Walker murmured from beside him. The older ranger chewed on a piece of dried beef, his eyes never leaving the warehouse. Same tooth that have been there since dawn. Lazy or confident? Both. Bad combination for us. Across the street, young Donovan emerged from a tavern called the Pelican's Rest, weaving slightly and singing loud enough to wake the dead. To anyone watching, he looked like another drunk merchant's son spending daddy's money on whores and whiskey. The act had taken him 3 days to perfect, and Hayes had to admit the boy was a natural. 8 men inside, Donovan slurred as he stumbled past their hiding spot. Crane's there now, playing cards with 3 others. Rest are sleeping off last night's drunk. Weapons. Rifles by the door, pistols on their belts. Nothing fancy, but they'll do the job if we give them time to use them. Hayes nodded, and Donovan continued his drunken progress down the street, singing a bawdy song about a sailor's daughter. The boy had done good work these past few days, mapping the warehouse interior and identifying Crane's men. Maybe too good. The kind of work that came naturally to someone who'd been lying about who he really was. "You think he's telling the truth?" Walker asked. "About the guards? About being a hardware merchant's son?" Hayes had been wondering the same thing. Donovan moved through Galveston's waterfront like he belonged there, knew which taverns to avoid, and which dockworkers could be bought with a drink. That wasn't knowledge you picked up working in Daddy's store. Does it matter? Might. If he's playing a deeper game than we know about. A church bell tolled 9 o'clock, the sound drifting across the harbor like a funeral dirge. Time to move. Hayes checked his weapons, pistol, knife, and a short club he'd picked up from a ship chandler. Nothing fancy, but he wasn't planning on a stand-up fight. Ready. Walker spat and wiped his mouth. Been ready since we got here. It's the waiting that's hard. They separated as planned, Walker heading for the warehouse's rear entrance while Hayes approached from the water side. The plan was simple enough. Create a distraction at the front while Walker slipped in the back. Get to the guns, get out, and ride hard for San Antonio before Crane's men could organize a pursuit. Simple plans were the best plans, Hayes had learned. Fewer things to go wrong. The 2 guards at the front door were sharing a bottle and arguing about a card game in Spanish. Neither looked particularly alert, but then again, why should they? Who'd be crazy enough to rob a warehouse full of armed men? Hayes crept along the pier's edge, using stacked cotton bales for cover. The water lapped against the pilings below, and somewhere in the darkness a fish jumped, sending ripples across the moonlit surface. Normal sounds of a normal night in a port city that thrived on other people's cargo. He reached the warehouse's waterside wall and pressed his ear against the stone. Voices inside, muffled but audible. Laughter from what sounded like a card game. The clink of coins and the scrape of chairs. Crane's men, enjoying their evening and not expecting trouble. A splash behind him made Hayes turn. Walker's head emerged from the dark water like some kind of river demon, his knife blade clenched between his teeth. The older ranger had swum around from the harbor side, using the pier pilings for cover. "Back doors bolted from inside," Walker whispered, pulling himself up onto the dock. "But there's a window, about 8 feet up. Bars look rusty. Can you reach it?" "With help." Hayes cupped his hands and boosted Walker up the wall. The older man grabbed the window bars and tested them gently. One creaked ominously, then pulled free from its stone mounting with a grinding sound that seemed loud enough to wake half of Galveston. Both rangers froze, listening. The voices inside continued their card game conversation. Either the men hadn't heard, or they were too drunk to care. Walker squeezed through the window opening and disappeared into the warehouse. Hayes counted to 30, then walked around to the front entrance. "Evening, boys," he said to the guards in his best drunk-friendly voice. "Here you might have some tobacco for sale." The guards looked up from their bottle, suspicious but not immediately hostile. The taller one, a Mexican with knife scars on his cheek, shook his head. "No tobacco, senor." This is Navy warehouse. Closed. Navy. Hayes swayed convincingly, playing the disappointed drunk. Thought the Navy was all finished. Heard they sold everything off to pay debts. You heard wrong. The second guard stood up, his hand moving toward his pistol. Move along, amigo. Nothing here for you. Ah, hell. Hayes pulled out a silver dollar and held it up where it caught the moonlight. Surely there's something. Been at sea for 2 months, and my tobacco pouch is empty as a preacher's promise. The guards exchanged glances. A silver dollar was real money to men who probably got paid in promises and leftover beans. Maybe we look inside, the scarred one said. See what we find. They were reaching for the warehouse door when the shooting started. The sound of gunfire erupted from inside the building. Pistol shots and the deeper boom of a rifle, followed by shouting in English and Spanish. One of the guards cursed and fumbled for his keys, while the other drew his pistol and spun toward Hayes. What the hell? Hayes hit him with the club, a short chopping blow that dropped the man like a sack of grain. The second guard got the door half open before Hayes grabbed him from behind, one arm around his throat, the other hand twisting the pistol out of his grip. Stay quiet and you live through this, Hayes whispered in his ear. The guard went limp, whether from fear or lack of air, Hayes couldn't tell. He dropped the unconscious man beside his partner and drew his own pistol, then slipped through the warehouse door. The interior was a maze of wooden crates and rope-wrapped bundles, all stacked to the ceiling and leaving narrow aisles between them. Oil lamps hung from the rafters, casting dancing shadows that turned every pile of cargo into a potential ambush. More gunshots echoed from the back of the building, along with Walker's voice roaring something that sounded like a Comanche war cry. Hayes grinned despite himself. The old bastard was enjoying this. Find him. Crane's voice, harsh with authority and edged with panic. Goddamn Rangers think they can waltz in here and steal from me. So much for the element of surprise. Hayes worked his way through the maze of crates, following the sound of voices toward what he hoped was the weapons cache. A man stepped into the aisle ahead of him, rifle at the ready, and Hayes shot him before he could bring the weapon to bear. The gunshot boomed in the enclosed space, loud enough to deafen. The wounded man screamed and fell backward, clutching his shoulder. His rifle clattered across the wooden floor and disappeared into the shadows. Got one, someone shouted. This way. Footsteps pounded toward him from 2 directions. Hayes ducked behind a stack of flour sacks just as a rifle ball splintered the wood inches from his head. White powder exploded from the punctured bags, filling the air with choking dust. He rolled sideways and came up firing, his shot taking a bearded man in the chest. The man spun around and went down hard, his own pistol discharging into the ceiling. Splinters rained down like wooden snow. Walker, Hayes called out. Here. The reply came from deeper in the warehouse. Found our prizes. Hayes fought his way through the maze toward Walker's voice, stepping over bodies and dodging wild shots from Crane's panicked men. The warehouse was full of smoke now, gun smoke and flour dust mixing into a choking fog that made breathing an effort. He found Walker in a cleared area at the back of the building, standing guard over 2 wooden crates that had been pried open. Inside, nestled in straw like sleeping serpents, lay the Colt revolvers. Even in the flickering lamplight, they were beautiful. Blued steel and walnut grips, each pistol fitted with a cylinder that held 5 chambers. Not 6 like Morales had claimed, but 5 shots was still 5 times better than the single-shot weapons they were used to. How many? Hayes asked, scooping up revolvers and stuffing them into a canvas sack. 22 total, plus powder and shot enough to fight a war. Walker was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but his hands were steady as he loaded weapons into a second sack. These beauties are going to change everything. If we live to use them. A new voice cut through the warehouse din, cold and controlled. "Nobody's using anything." Josiah Crane stepped into the lamplight, his own pistol trained on Hayes. He was younger than expected, maybe 35, with the kind of pale eyes that belonged on a snake. Two more men flanked him, rifles ready. "Captain Jack Hayes," Crane said conversationally. "Heard you were dead. Comanche got you up on the Guadalupe." "Disappointed?" "Not particularly. Dead or alive, you're worth money to the right people." Crane's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Comancheros pay good prices for ranger scalps, especially famous ones." Walker shifted slightly, putting himself at an angle where he could cover both riflemen. The movement was subtle, but Crane caught it. "Don't," he warned. "I've got 6 more men between you and the door. This can end easy or hard, but it's going to end." That's when young Donovan appeared behind Crane like a ghost, no longer playing the drunk merchant's son. The knife went into Crane's back, just below the ribs, angled upward toward the heart. Crane's eyes went wide with surprise and pain. "Hard it is," Donovan said quietly and twisted the blade. Chapter 5. Josiah Crane died with his mouth open, surprise frozen on his face like ice on a winter pond. He toppled forward, Donovan's knife still buried between his ribs, and hit the warehouse floor with the wet sound meat makes when it falls from a great height. His 2 riflemen hesitated for a heartbeat, long enough for Walker to put a ball through the nearest man's chest, and Hayes to club the other with a Colt revolver. The warehouse went quiet, except for the crackle of spilled lamp oil starting to catch fire. "We need to move," Hayes said, stuffing the last of the revolvers into canvas sacks. "This place is going to burn, and those gunshots will bring every constable in Galveston." Donovan pulled his knife from Crane's back and wiped the blade clean on the dead man's shirt. His movements were precise, practiced, not the fumbling of someone killing for the first time. "There's a back way out," he said. "Leads to the marsh behind the docks. Crane showed it to me yesterday when he was drunk." Walker stared at the young man with new eyes. "Crane showed you? Thought you were just playing drunk in the taverns." "I was. Among other things." The flames were spreading now, creeping along spilled lamp oil, toward stacks of cotton bales that would burn like the devil's own bonfire. Smoke was already making breathing difficult, and the heat was building fast. "Explanations later," Hayes said. "Move." They grabbed the sacks of weapons and followed Donovan through the maze of burning crates toward the rear of the warehouse. Behind them, flames roared to life as the fire reached a cache of turpentine, sending a pillar of orange light through the smoke. The back door opened onto a narrow dock that extended into the salt marsh. Their horses waited where they'd left them, hidden in a grove of Spanish moss-draped live oaks. 3 mounts for 3 men, loaded with gear for a hard ride back to San Antonio. They were tying the weapon sacks behind their saddles when the first shots came from the burning warehouse. "Company," Walker said, swinging into his saddle. A dozen men poured out of the smoke and flames, some of them on fire themselves, all of them shooting at anything that moved. Crane's surviving gunmen, mad with pain and rage, determined to take someone with them into hell. Hayes spurred his horse toward the mainland road, the other 2 rangers flanking him. Behind them, bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. One shot splintered the live oak branch above his head, showering him with leaves and Spanish moss. They made it maybe 100 yards before the trap sprung. The Comancheros came out of the marsh grass like painted devils, 20 mounted men who'd been waiting in the darkness for exactly this moment. Their leader was a breed named Santos, half Mexican and half Comanche, with a necklace of dried ears around his throat and hate in his black eyes. "Rangers," Santos called out in accented English. "You have something that belongs to my friends." The gunrunners spread out in a semicircle, cutting off the road to the mainland. Their horses danced nervously in the marsh water, but the riders sat steady as rocks, rifles and pistols ready. "Shit," Walker muttered. "How'd they know we were coming?" Hayes was wondering the same thing. The Comancheros had been waiting in perfect position, knew exactly when and where to ambush them. That took advance warning from someone who knew their plans. He looked at Donovan, who sat his horse with the calm of a man who'd expected this all along. "Something you want to tell us, boy?" Donovan's young face was unreadable in the moonlight. "My name's not William Donovan. It's Billy Vance." The name hit Hayes like a physical blow. "Vance? Eleanor's my sister. Half-sister, anyway. Same mother, different fathers." Walker's pistol was in his hand now, though he kept it low and casual. That's a hell of a thing to mention now. Seemed like the wrong time before. Billy's eyes never left the Comancheros. "Nora sent me to keep you from getting killed. Said you had a talent for riding into situations you couldn't shoot your way out of. So you decided to help us steal the guns. Figured, if I couldn't stop you, I could at least make sure you survived long enough to use them." Santos was getting impatient. "Enough talking. Throw down the weapons, and maybe we let you live." "Counter-offer," Hayes called back. "Ride away now, and maybe we don't kill all of you." The Comanchero leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 3 men against 20. I like those odds. 3 Rangers, Walker corrected. With Colt revolvers. That got Santos's attention. He leaned forward in his saddle, studying the weapons in their hands. Word of the warehouse raid had traveled fast apparently, along with news about what they'd stolen. 5 shots each, Santos said thoughtfully. 15 shots total. Still not enough. Want to find out? The standoff stretched like a bowstring, both sides waiting for someone to make the first move. The burning warehouse cast dancing shadows across the marsh, turning the water red as blood. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. Galveston's fire brigade, too late to save anything but ashes. That's when Billy Vance did something that surprised everyone. He laughed. "You know what's funny about this?" he said to Santos. "You're all going to die, and you don't even know why." The Comanchero's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Those aren't the only Colts in Texas." Billy gestured toward the burning warehouse. "Crane had 20 more hidden in a second cache. Sold them to the Mexican army 3 days ago." Santos went very still. "You lie. Ask your friends back at the warehouse." "Oh wait, they're all dead or on fire." Hayes had no idea what game Billy was playing, but he could see it was working. The Comancheros were shifting nervously, wondering if they'd been double-crossed by their dead partner. "Even if that's true," Santos said, "these guns are still worth." Billy shot him. The Colt revolver boomed like thunder, and Santos pitched backward off his horse with a hole in his chest the size of a silver dollar. Before his body hit the marsh water, all hell broke loose. The Comancheros opened fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like deadly fireworks. But the Rangers were already moving, spurring their horses in 3 different directions, making themselves harder targets while they returned fire with the multi-shot weapons. Hayes put 2 rounds into a Comanchero on a paint horse, watching the man fold over his saddle horn like a broken doll. Walker's Colt spoke 3 times fast, dropping a rider and his mount both. Billy worked his way through his cylinder methodically, each shot finding its mark. The difference was stunning. Instead of firing once and then fumbling to reload while their enemies closed in, the Rangers could keep shooting, keep the pressure on, force the Comancheros to take cover instead of charging. But 20 enemies were still 20 enemies, and even Colt revolvers ran empty eventually. "Reloading!" Walker shouted, his horse dancing sideways as bullets kicked up marsh water around them. A Comanchero on a bay mare saw his chance and charged, lance couched like a medieval knight. Hayes tried to swing his own Colt around, but the man was too close, coming too fast. Billy put a bullet through the charging horse's head. The animal went down like it had run into a stone wall, throwing its rider into the marsh with enough force to break bones. The man tried to get up, fell back, and didn't move again. "Nice shot," Hayes called out. "Save the compliments for later." 3 more Comancheros were closing from the left, firing as they came. Their bullets went wide in the confusion and poor light, but they were getting closer with each stride. Hayes finished reloading and put 2 shots into the lead rider, who tumbled into the marsh grass and lay still. The other 2 kept coming. Walker's Colt clicked empty. He threw it aside and drew his old single-shot pistol, but he was still 20 yards away, and 1 pistol ball wouldn't stop 2 mounted men. Billy's revolver spoke twice more. Both Comancheros went down in a tangle of thrashing horses and screaming men. The sudden silence was almost deafening. Hayes counted bodies in the moonlight. Santos and 6 of his men dead, maybe 7. The rest had melted back into the marsh grass, deciding that discretion was worth more than whatever Crane had been paying them. "That was some shooting," Walker said, reloading his weapons with hands that shook slightly from excitement. Billy holstered his Colt and looked at Hayes. "Still planning to kill me for lying about who I am?" "Depends. Any other surprises I should know about?" "Just one." Billy's grin was visible even in the darkness. "Nora's going to be madder than a wet cat when she finds out I helped you steal those guns instead of talking you out of it." Walker laughed despite himself. "Boy, you just saved our lives. I think she'll forgive you. You don't know my sister." Behind them, the warehouse collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. The Colt revolvers were safe, 22 weapons that would change the balance of power between Rangers and Comanche. The price had been high: good men dead, a city on fire, and enemies who would remember this night for years to come. But the weapons were theirs now. The question was whether they could get back to San Antonio alive to use them. "Mount up," Hayes said. "We've got a long ride ahead." They spurred their horses toward the mainland road, leaving the burning warehouse and the floating bodies behind. Somewhere in the marsh grass, surviving Comancheros watched them go and planned their revenge. Chapter 6. They rode hard through the Texas night, 3 men and 22 revolvers that would either save the frontier or get them all hanged for theft. The horses were blowing foam by the time they reached the pine woods east of Houston, their hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the packed earth road that led toward San Antonio. Hayes kept checking their back trail, but the darkness behind them stayed empty. Either the surviving Comancheros had given up the chase or they were being more careful about it. Neither possibility made him feel better. "We need to rest the horses," Walker said, his voice tight with exhaustion. They'd been riding for 6 hours straight, stopping only to water their mounts at creek crossings. "Another hour," Hayes replied. "Put more distance between us and Galveston." Billy Vance, Hayes was still getting used to the name, rode slightly apart from the other 2, as if uncertain of his welcome now that his deception was revealed. The boy had proven himself in the fight, but trust was harder to rebuild than it was to break. "There's a way station up ahead," Billy said. "Old trading post. Owner's name is Kowalski, Polish fellow who came over after the revolution. He'll sell us grain for the horses and keep his mouth shut about seeing us." "How do you know that?" Walker asked. "Because I've used the place before. When you were pretending to be a hardware merchant's son." Billy's laugh had no humor in it. "I haven't been pretending to be anything for a long time, Captain Walker. Sometimes a man just uses whatever name gets him through the day." They found the trading post exactly where Billy had said it would be, a low-built log structure with a corral and barn behind it. Lamplight showed through the single window, and smoke rose from the stone chimney. Someone was awake, despite the late hour. Hayes dismounted and loosened his Colt in its holster before knocking on the door. Footsteps approached from inside, heavy and cautious. "Who's there?" The voice carried a thick accent that turned the words into something foreign. "Travelers," Hayes called back. "Need grain for our horses and a place to rest." "At this hour? What kind of travelers ride at night?" "The kind with money to spend." A bar lifted on the other side of the door, and it swung open to reveal a bear of a man with graying hair and suspicious eyes. He wore homespun clothes and carried an old flintlock musket that had seen better decades. "You are not bandits?" Kowalski asked, studying their faces in the lamplight. "Rangers," Hayes said. "Texas Rangers." The suspicion in the Polish man's eyes didn't fade. "Rangers, bandits, sometimes it's hard to tell difference." "You have money." Hayes pulled out a silver dollar and held it where the light caught it. "Grain, water, and silence. That buy what we need?" Kowalski's thick fingers closed around the coin. "For this you get all three. But if you bring trouble to my place—" "No trouble," Walker said. "Just men traveling home." They led their horses to the corral, while Kowalski fetched grain and water. The animals fell on the feed like they hadn't eaten in days, which wasn't far from the truth. Good horses were hard to replace on the frontier, and they'd pushed these mounts harder than any man had a right to. "Your friend," Kowalski said to Hayes, nodding toward Billy. "He was here before. 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. Different name then." "Different business too, I'd guess." "None of my business what business he had. But he paid in gold, not silver. Gold makes man remember things." Billy emerged from the shadows near the barn, moving with the quiet step of someone who'd learned to walk softly. "Everything's secure." "For now." Hayes studied the young man's face in the moonlight. "Time you told us who you really are." "I told you. Billy Vance. Nora's half-brother." "That's a name and a relation. Not the same as knowing who someone is." Billy was quiet for a moment, listening to the night sounds around them. Somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called to its mate. Closer, their horses snorted and stamped as they worked on their grain. "You know what it's like growing up, bastard?" Billy asked, finally. "Different last name from your sister, different father you never met, mother who died when you were too young to remember her face." "Can't say I do." Makes a man flexible about things like names and occupations. I've been William Donovan when it suited me, Billy Vance when it didn't. Been a merchant's assistant, a gambling man, a scout for wagon trains. Whatever paid enough to keep me fed. Walker spat into the dust. "And what were you 2 weeks ago, when you were here with gold to spend?" "Working for the Comancheros." The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Hayes felt his hand move toward his Colt before he stopped himself. "Working for them, how?" "Information, mostly. Troop movements, ranger patrols, which settlements were weak, and which ones weren't worth the trouble." Billy's voice was steady, matter of fact. "Paid well for good intelligence." "Jesus Christ," Walker breathed. "You sold out rangers to gunrunners." "I sold information to men who paid for it. Same as any businessman." Hayes studied the young man's face, looking for shame or regret or any sign of conscience. What he saw instead was the kind of cold pragmatism that kept a man alive in a world that didn't care whether he lived or died. "What changed your mind?" "Nora." Billy's expression softened slightly. "She found out what I was doing. Came to my room in Galveston 3 weeks ago and told me I was going to get rangers killed. Good men with families who trusted their lives to information that was supposed to be secret. So you quit. She made me an offer. Stop selling intelligence to the Comancheros and help keep you alive, or she'd turn me into the authorities herself. Walker laughed bitterly. Family loyalty at gunpoint. The only kind that matters. But once I started following you, listening to your plans. Billy shrugged. Maybe I remembered what it felt like to be on the right side of something. Or maybe you're still working for the Comancheros and this is all part of some bigger game. If I was still working for them, why would I have killed Santos? He was paying me more than you'll ever see in ranger wages. It was a fair point, Hayes had to admit. Billy had put a bullet through the Comanchero leader's heart without hesitation. Hard to fake that kind of commitment. Those men you got killed, Walker said. Rangers who died because you sold information about their movements. Their blood's on your hands. I know. That's supposed to make it right. Nothing makes it right. But maybe helping you get those Colts back to San Antonio starts to balance the scales. Kowalski emerged from his cabin with a jug of whiskey and 3 tin cups. You want to argue, do it quiet, he said. Sound carries far at night, and not all ears are friendly. They drank in silence, the raw whiskey burning away some of the exhaustion but none of the tension. Somewhere in the darkness a coyote howled, and their horses shifted nervously in the corral. We can't trust him, Walker said finally. Man who sold out Rangers once will do it again. Maybe, Hayes agreed. But he saved our lives back there. That has to count for something. Could be part of the plan. Gain our trust, then lead us into another trap. Billy set down his cup and looked at both men. You want to know the truth. I don't blame you for not trusting me. Hell, I wouldn't trust me either. But those guns are going to change everything. And the Comanche need to know that. Need to understand that the old ways of fighting are over. Since when do you care about fighting Comanche? Since I saw what they did to a wagon train last month. Whole family, including 2 little girls who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Billy's voice went hard. Some things are worth fighting for, even if you've spent most of your life on the wrong side. Hayes finished his whiskey and stood up. The night was getting old, and they still had 100 miles to cover before they reached San Antonio. But something in Billy's voice, some note of genuine conviction, made him want to believe the young man's redemption was real. We'll give you a chance, he said. But if you betray us, if you lead us into another trap, I'll put a Colt bullet through your head myself. Fair enough. They saddled their horses and prepared to ride again. The animals were rested, their coats dry, their breathing steady. Good for another 50 miles before they'd need to stop again. One more thing, Hayes said as they mounted up. When we get back to San Antonio, you're going to face Nora and explain why you helped us steal those guns instead of talking us out of it. Billy's grin was visible even in the darkness. Captain, facing angry Comancheros was easy compared to that. They rode out into the Texas night, 3 men carrying weapons that would change the balance of power on the frontier. Behind them, Kowalski watched from his doorway until they disappeared into the darkness, then went inside and loaded his musket. On the frontier, a man could never be too careful about the strangers he helped. Chapter 7. The Rangers reached San Antonio just as the sun painted the adobe buildings gold, their horses stumbling with exhaustion and their own faces drawn tight with fatigue. Hayes led them through the back streets to avoid the plaza, where too many eyes might notice 3 men carrying heavy saddlebags and asking no questions. They'd lost 2 horses on the ride back. Walker's mount went lame near Gonzales, and Billy's gelding stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke its leg 20 miles out. Now they rode double, the precious colts distributed between all 3 men like some deadly treasure. There, Hayes pointed to a low adobe building behind the old mission. Antonio Fuentes runs a livery there. Keeps his mouth shut, and his price is reasonable. The Mexican stableman emerged from the dim interior as they approached, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His weathered face showed no surprise at seeing 3 exhausted riders at dawn. In San Antonio, such sights were common as mesquite thorns. Capitan Hayes, Fuentes nodded. Your horses, they look like they have seen hard country. Hard enough. Can you care for them, without mentioning to anyone that we were here? For the right price. I see nothing, hear nothing, remember nothing. Hayes dropped a gold piece into the man's palm. Feed them well. They've earned it. They shouldered their saddlebags and walked through the awakening streets toward the center of town. Vendors were setting up their stalls in the plaza, and the smell of coffee and fresh tortillas drifted from the cook fires. Normal morning sounds of a normal town that had no idea 3 men had just brought enough firepower to change the course of the Indian Wars. Where do we set up? Walker asked, adjusting the weight of his saddlebag. Ranger barracks are too public, Hayes said. Too many politicians wandering through, asking questions we don't want to answer. My sister's tavern has a back room, Billy suggested. Private, secure, and Nora can keep curious folks away from the door. Walker snorted. Assuming she doesn't shoot you for lying to her about who you were. She might. But she won't shoot you too. They found Nora's tavern already open for business, though the morning crowd was sparse. A few teamsters nursing coffee and planning their day's haul, 2 soldiers from the garrison arguing quietly over a checkerboard. The familiar smell of wood smoke and bacon grease made Hayes realize he hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Nora emerged from behind the bar carrying a pot of coffee, her dark hair tied back with a blue ribbon, and her face showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights. She saw Hayes first, and relief flooded her features like sunrise after a long storm. Then she saw Billy. The coffee pot slipped from her hands and shattered on the wooden floor, sending hot liquid and pottery shards across the room. The teamsters looked up from their breakfast, mildly interested in this domestic drama playing out before them. You, she said to Billy, her voice barely above a whisper. I sent you to keep him safe, not help him rob warehouses. Good morning to you too, sister. Don't you sister me, you lying snake. Do you have any idea what I've been through these past 3 days? Wondering if you were both dead in some Galveston alley. We're fine, Hayes said, stepping between them before the argument could escalate. Both of us. Thanks to Billy. Nora's eyes flashed. Thanks to Billy? He was supposed to talk you out of this fool errand, not become part of it. Plans change. Plans. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You call stealing Navy weapons a plan? What's next, Jack? Going to rob the mint in New Orleans. One of the teamsters cleared his throat. Maybe we should finish our coffee elsewhere, boys. Good idea, the other agreed. They left coins on their table and headed for the door, sensing that whatever was brewing here was none of their business. Nora waited until they were gone, then turned to face all 3 men with her hands on her hips. Back room. Now. And if anyone asks, you were never here. The back room was small and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Crates of whiskey and supplies lined one wall, and a rough wooden table dominated the center. Hayes set his saddlebag on the table and opened it carefully. The Colt revolvers lay nestled in cloth like sleeping serpents, their steel surfaces gleaming in the lamplight. Even Nora, angry as she was, drew in a sharp breath at the sight of them. Sweet Mary, she whispered. There are so many. 22 total, Walker said, opening his own bag. Plus powder, shot, and percussion caps. Enough to arm a full company of rangers. Hayes lifted one of the revolvers and checked its action. The cylinder rotated smoothly, each chamber aligning perfectly with the barrel. Samuel Colt knew his business, no question about it. "They're beautiful," Billy said, handling one of the weapons with professional appreciation. "Balanced, well made. These aren't the crude prototypes I've heard about. These are production models." "You sound like you know something about guns," Walker observed. "A man in my former line of work learns to appreciate quality weapons." Nora picked up one of the Colts, testing its weight in her hands. "How do they work?" "Like this." Hayes demonstrated, loading powder and shot into each chamber, then placing percussion caps on the nipples. 5 shots without reloading. Point and pull the trigger, just like any pistol. "Show me." They moved to the tavern's small backyard, where Hayes set up a target against the adobe wall, an empty whiskey bottle placed on a wooden post. Nora raised the Colt, sighted carefully, and pulled the trigger. The bottle exploded in a shower of brown glass. "Again," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. She fired 4 more times, each shot finding its mark on smaller targets Hayes set up. Her natural shooting ability was impressive, but it was the weapon's effect on her that caught his attention. The confident way she handled it, the steady rhythm of her shots, this wasn't just target practice. This was a woman learning to defend herself. "Why?" he asked when she'd emptied the cylinder. "Because you're not the only one who needs to know how to use these." She set the empty Colt on the table and looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge of frontier violence. "The Comanche aren't just going to disappear because you have new guns. They'll adapt, change their tactics. And when they do, they'll come for the settlements first. San Antonio has walls, soldiers. San Antonio has politicians and bureaucrats. When the killing starts, they'll run for Austin and leave the rest of us to face whatever comes." Walker nodded approvingly. "Smart woman. I've seen too many settlements burned because folks thought walls and soldiers were enough." "So you'll teach me?" Nora asked Hayes. "I'll teach you. But I won't be here long enough to make you an expert." "Where are you going?" "Back to the field. These weapons won't prove themselves sitting in a back room." Hayes began cleaning the used Colt, his movements automatic after years of maintaining firearms. "The Comanche are still out there, still raiding. Now we have the tools to fight them on equal terms." "Equal terms?" Billy laughed harshly. "You think 22 revolvers make you equal to Buffalo Hump and his warriors? They're a start. They're a target. Every Comanche chief between here and the Red River is going to want those guns. You'll have every war party in Texas hunting you. Let them come. That's what Rangers are for." Nora was quiet for a long moment, watching him work on the revolver. When she spoke, her voice was steady but strained. "How many men will you take with you?" "As many as I can find. Walker's already agreed to ride with me. Need maybe 10 more. Experienced men who can handle these weapons and won't break when the fighting gets serious. And then we find Buffalo Hump and show him what his new world looks like." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the adobe floor. "I need some air." Nora walked out into the main room of the tavern, leaving the 3 men alone with their deadly cargo. Through the open doorway, they could hear her moving around, cleaning up the broken coffee pot, preparing for the day's customers. "She's scared," Billy said quietly. "She has a right to be," Walker replied. "What we're planning is going to change everything. Change always comes with a price." Hayes continued working on the Colt, checking each mechanism with the thoroughness of a man whose life might depend on its reliability. The weapon was a masterpiece of engineering, but engineering meant nothing if the man behind it lacked the will to use it effectively. "We'll need to train the men properly," he said. "These aren't single-shot weapons. Different tactics, different techniques. Can't just hand them out and expect miracles." "How long do you figure we have?" Walker asked. "Before what?" "Before every Comanche war chief in Texas knows about these guns and comes looking for them." Hayes thought about Santos and his Comancheros, about the survivors who'd melted back into the marsh grass around Galveston. Word would spread fast through the network of traders and informants that connected the frontier communities. Buffalo Hump would know within days, if he didn't already. "Not long," he admitted. "Maybe a week, 2 at most. Then we better make them count." Outside in the tavern, Nora was serving coffee to a new customer, her voice steady and professional despite the morning's revelations. But Hayes could hear the strain underneath, the fear of a woman who'd watched too many men ride away with confidence and come back over their saddles. The Colt revolvers had given them new hope, new possibilities. But hope, like any other weapon, was only as good as the man who wielded it. Chapter 8. The flames reached toward heaven like the prayers of the damned, turning Nora's tavern into a torch that lit up half of San Antonio. She crouched behind an overturned water trough in the plaza, clutching a small pepperbox pistol in hands that shook despite her best efforts to steady them. 20 yards away, a Comanchero with a scarred face and gold teeth was reloading his rifle, taking his time because he thought she was just another helpless woman waiting to die. He'd already put 2 bullets through the trough, showering her with splinters and foul water, but his shots were going wide in the smoke and confusion. The child beside her whimpered, a Mexican boy of maybe 7, his mother dead in the wreckage of their cart, his father nowhere to be seen. Blood seeped from a gash on the boy's forehead where flying debris had caught him, but his eyes were alert, watching her every move. "Silencio, pequeño," she whispered. "Stay low." The attack had come at sunset, just as Hayes and his rangers were 3 days out of San Antonio on their way to establish a training camp in the hill country. 8 Comancheros had ridden into the plaza like they owned it, torches in their hands and murder in their hearts. Payback for Galveston, for Santos, for the stolen Colts that had upset the balance of their bloody trade. They'd started with the Mexican Quarter, setting fire to Jacales and shooting anyone who tried to flee. Then they'd worked their way toward the center of town, where the Anglo merchants and their families huddled behind locked doors and prayed for the garrison to respond. But the garrison was understaffed and poorly led, commanded by a political appointee who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. By the time the soldiers organized themselves, half the plaza was burning and screams echoed off the mission walls. Nora had been serving dinner to a family of German immigrants when the first flames appeared. She'd herded her customers into the root cellar behind the tavern, then grabbed her small pistol, a gift from Hayes that she'd never expected to use, and gone looking for anyone else who needed help. That's when she'd found the boy, crouched beside his dead mother's cart while Comancheros ransacked the goods scattered across the ground. One of the raiders had seen her and given chase, driving her toward the plaza where other survivors had taken whatever cover they could find. The scarred Comanchero finished reloading and raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the water trough. Nora knew the rotting wood wouldn't stop a rifle ball, knew that her little 4-shot pepperbox was no match for his long gun. But she also knew that running would expose the boy to his fire, and she'd already watched too many children die tonight. She rose from behind the trough, the pepperbox extended in both hands the way Hayes had taught her, and put a bullet through the Comanchero's chest before he could pull his trigger. The man staggered backward, surprise replacing the cruel confidence on his face. He tried to bring his rifle up, but blood was filling his lungs now, and his strength was flowing out onto the packed earth of the plaza. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face and didn't move again. "Santa Maria," the boy breathed. "You killed the Diablo." "There are more devils," Nora said, checking the loads in her remaining chambers. "Stay close to me." They moved through the smoke-filled plaza like ghosts, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares where Comancheros still hunted. The mission bells were ringing now, calling the faithful to safety within the thick stone walls, but the bells also drew attention from the raiders. A woman's scream came from the direction of Mueller's general store. Nora recognized the voice. Gretchen Muller, the storekeeper's pregnant wife, who'd been kind to Nora when other German settlers kept their distance from the tavern keeper who consorted with rangers. "This way," she told the boy, and they ran toward the sound. They found Gretchen backed against the store's front wall, her hands protecting her swollen belly, while a lean Comanchero with braided hair circled her like a wolf, toying with wounded prey. He held a curved knife that gleamed red in the firelight, and his smile was the kind that belonged in nightmares. "Please," Gretchen sobbed in accented English. "The baby." "Baby make good slave," the Comanchero said. "Teach him proper way to serve his betters." Nora shot him twice, both bullets taking him in the back before he could turn around. He pitched forward into the dirt, his knife spinning away into the darkness. "Nora." Gretchen stumbled toward her savior, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "Mein Gott," I thought. "Can you walk?" "Yeah, I think so." "Then we go to the mission. Stone Walls Sanctuary." They moved as quickly as Gretchen's condition allowed, the pregnant woman leaning heavily on Nora's arm while the Mexican boys scouted ahead. The plaza was a maze of burning debris and abandoned carts, with bodies scattered like broken dolls in the orange light. Near the fountain in the center of the square, they came upon another scene of horror. 3 Comancheros had cornered an elderly priest against the mission steps, their leader, a massive man with ritual scars covering his chest, holding a tomahawk over the old man's head. "Where are the rangers?" the scarred leader demanded. "Where did they take the devil guns?" Father Miguel, who'd ministered to San Antonio's souls for 30 years, looked up at his tormentor with the calm of a man who'd made peace with his maker. "I know nothing of guns, my son. Only of mercy. Then you die, ignorant." The tomahawk rose, and Nora knew her little pepper box wouldn't stop a man that size. One shot left, and he was 30 yards away with his back turned. Even if she hit him, he'd probably live long enough to kill the priest. But sometimes, a woman had to try. She handed Gretchen over to the boy's care, and crept closer, using an overturned wagon for cover. The pepper box felt impossibly small in her hands, a toy weapon against a giant who'd probably survived a dozen battles and twice as many raids. At 20 yards, she could see the sweat on his scarred back, could smell the mixture of wood smoke and horse sweat that clung to him like perfume. The tomahawk gleamed in the firelight, poised to split Father Miguel's skull like a melon. She put her last bullet into the base of his skull. The big Comanchero dropped like a felled tree, his tomahawk clattering harmlessly against the mission steps. His 2 companions spun toward the sound of the shot, but they were too late. The damage was done, their leader was dead, and a woman with an empty gun was already disappearing back into the smoke. "Run," she called to Father Miguel. "Get inside the mission." The old priest needed no further encouragement. He gathered his robes and hurried up the steps, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors that would soon bar themselves against the night's violence. Nora made it back to Gretchen and the boy, just as the remaining Comancheros decided they'd done enough damage for one evening. She watched from the shadows as they gathered their dead and wounded, loaded them onto stolen horses, and rode out of San Antonio the same way they'd come, like demons returning to hell after a night's work. The garrison soldiers finally appeared 20 minutes later, when the fires were dying down, and the immediate danger had passed. They formed neat ranks in the plaza and stood at attention while their captain made a speech about defending civilization against the savage hordes. Nora didn't listen. She was too busy helping Gretchen Muller to the mission, where other survivors were gathering to tend wounds and count the cost of the night's violence. The pregnant woman was going into labor, brought on by shock and terror, and the old midwife would need all the help she could get. "Señora," the Mexican boy tugged at her dress. "The bad men, they said something about devil guns. What did they mean?" Nora looked down at the child who'd survived the night because she'd been willing to kill for him. His dark eyes held questions she wasn't ready to answer, truths about the price of progress and the cost of change. "I don't know, Pequeno," she lied. "Sometimes bad men say many things." But she knew exactly what they'd meant. The Colt revolvers were already changing the balance of power on the frontier, and men like the Comancheros would kill anyone who stood between them and those weapons. Tonight's raid was just the beginning, a message written in blood and fire. When Jack Hayes returned from his training camp, he'd find a different San Antonio waiting for him. A town that had learned the hard way that wars weren't fought only by soldiers, that sometimes the real battles happened in the streets where women and children had to choose between courage and death. She reloaded her pepper box from the powder and shot she kept in her apron pocket, hands steady now that the immediate danger had passed. Tomorrow she'd ask Father Miguel to say masses for the dead, both innocent and guilty. Tonight, she'd stand guard over the living and prepare for whatever came next. Chapter 9. "You see him?" "I see his dust," Sam Walker said, not bothering to lift the spyglass. He worked a piece of jerky between his teeth, his jaw moving with the slow patience of a man paid to wait. "Been seeing it for an hour. He's in no hurry." Jack Hayes lay flat on the limestone ridge, the sun hot on his back, the rock warm beneath his buckskin shirt. The spyglass was cool against his eye. Below, the prairie shimmered in the heat, a sea of bleached grass and stunted mesquite. The dust cloud belonged to a lone rider, a Comanche scout by the look of him, ambling his pony along the creek bed as if he were out for a Sunday stroll. "He's not looking for us," Billy Vance said from Hayes's left. The boy, Hayes still thought of him as a boy, though he'd killed men with a steadiness that was anything but boyish, had his new revolver out checking the caps. It was a habit all 12 of them had picked up, this constant fiddling with the new weapons. "He's looking for stragglers. A lone farmer, maybe a broken-down wagon." "He's going to find us instead," Hayes said, collapsing the spyglass. The metal was hot. He tucked it into his saddlebag. "Let him get a little closer. We need him to see us. We need him to run back and tell his friends what he saw." Walker spat. "You sure about this, Jack? Showing our hand this early?" "They know we have the guns," Hayes said. The memory of Nora's tavern burning, of the Comancheros screaming about devil guns in the San Antonio Plaza was still fresh. "They just don't know what they can do. It's time we taught them." The 12 Rangers were spread along the ridge, hidden in the scrub and rocks. They were a hard-bitten crew, a mix of seasoned veterans like Walker and new recruits who'd signed on after hearing about the Galveston raid. They all had two things in common. They hated Comanche, and they were all armed with a 5-shot Colt Patterson revolver. The scout below rode into a patch of shade beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, letting his pony drink from the slow-moving creek. He was young, maybe 16, with 2 feathers tied in his long black hair. He carried a short bow and a quiver of arrows. Against a single-shot rifle, he'd be deadly. Against 12 revolvers, he was a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. "All right," Hayes said, his voice low. "Let's give him something to look at." Hayes stood up. Walker and Billy Vance rose with him. One by one, The other 9 rangers appeared on the ridge, standing in plain sight, making no move to hide. The Comanche scout saw them instantly. His head snapped up, his body going rigid. He stared at the line of men on the ridge, his hand reaching for his bow. He was a mile away, too far for a shot, but close enough to count. He counted 12 men, standing silent and still, watching him. He hesitated for a long moment, his mind working. This wasn't how rangers behaved. Rangers were ghosts, hiding in the brush, waiting for an ambush. They didn't stand on a ridge like they were posing for a painting. Then he wheeled his pony around and kicked it into a gallop, riding hard back the way he'd come. "There he goes," Walker said. Off to tell the chief he found a dozen crazy white men out, sunning themselves. "Let's not disappoint them," Hayes said, turning back to his horse. "Mount up. We'll follow his dust. Stay a mile behind him. Let him lead us right to them." They rode for 2 hours, the sun climbing higher, the heat becoming a physical presence. The scout's dust trail was easy to follow, a brown smudge against the blue sky. He was riding for a place called Painted Rocks, a series of low mesas and canyons where Buffalo Hump's war parties often camped. "He's taking the bait," Billy said, riding alongside Hayes. "He thinks we're following him blind." "We are," Hayes said. "But we're holding a better hand of cards." They found the raiding party an hour later. 20 Comanche warriors, camped in a box canyon with steep rock walls on 3 sides. They were cooking a deer over a small fire, their ponies grazing nearby. The scout was talking excitedly, gesturing back toward the ridge where he'd seen the rangers. The leader of the war party, a broad-chested warrior with a necklace of bear claws, listened impatiently. He was a sub-chief named Stoneheart, a man known for his cruelty and his recklessness. He saw the scout's story as an opportunity, not a threat. 12 rangers foolishly exposing themselves, ripe for the picking. Hayes watched them from the canyon rim, his men hidden behind him. "All right," he said, turning to his rangers. "You all know the plan. Walker, you take 5 men and circle around to the mouth of the canyon. When you hear my first shot, you close the trap. Nobody gets out." Walker nodded, his face grim. "We'll be there." "The rest of you with me," Hayes said. "We ride straight in. No hiding, no fancy tactics. We ride in, and we show them what these guns can do. Don't fire until I do. And don't stop firing until they stop moving." The 6 rangers with Hayes mounted up, their faces a mixture of excitement and fear. They'd spent a week practicing with the new revolvers, learning to load them, to fire them, to handle the recoil. But this was the first time they would use them in a real fight. Hayes led them down a narrow game trail into the canyon. They rode slowly, their horses' hooves making soft thuds in the sandy soil. The Comanche saw them when they were still 200 yards away. The warriors scrambled for their weapons, surprise turning to confidence as they saw how few rangers there were. 6 men, riding into a canyon held by 20. It was suicide. Stoneheart laughed and knocked an arrow to his bow. He raised it, taking aim at Hayes. Hayes drew his Colt. The blued steel gleamed in the sunlight. He cocked the hammer, the sound a sharp, clean click in the sudden silence of the canyon. He aimed at Stoneheart's chest and pulled the trigger. The revolver bucked in his hand, the explosion echoing off the canyon walls. Stoneheart grunted, a red flower blooming on his buckskin shirt. He staggered backward, his arrow flying harmlessly into the sky. He fell and didn't get up. For a heartbeat, the canyon was frozen. The Comanches stared at their dead leader, then at Hayes, their minds struggling to understand what had just happened. The ranger hadn't stopped to reload. He was still aiming his pistol. Then Hayes fired again. A warrior trying to string his bow spun around and fell. Then Billy Vance fired. Then the other 4 rangers opened up. The canyon erupted in a storm of gunfire. It was a continuous, rolling thunder that the Comanche had never heard before. White men fired once, then fumbled with powder horns and ramrods. These men just kept firing. A warrior on a paint pony charged, his lance leveled. 3 bullets hit him at once. He flew from his saddle, as if struck by a giant fist. His horse screamed and bolted. Another warrior tried to take cover behind a rock. Billy put a bullet into the rock inches from his head, showering him with stone fragments. The warrior flinched, and Billy's next shot took him in the throat. The Comanche were brave men. They had fought and won 100 battles. But they had never faced anything like this. Their courage broke. They dropped their weapons and ran for their horses, for the mouth of the canyon, for any escape from the storm of lead that was tearing them apart. That's when Walker and his 5 men appeared at the canyon mouth, their own revolvers blazing. The trap was sprung. The slaughter began. Hayes rode forward, his Colt smoking in his hand. He reloaded as he rode, a practice motion now, powder ball cap rotate the cylinder. He saw a wounded warrior trying to crawl into the brush. He rode up to him and fired one more time. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, 20 Comanche warriors lay dead in the canyon. The Rangers had suffered 1 casualty. A man named Miller had taken an arrow in the thigh, a shallow wound that was already being bandaged. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise had been. The Rangers looked at the carnage around them, their faces pale with shock and awe. They had just killed 20 men in 3 minutes, and had barely suffered a scratch. "Sweet Jesus," one of the new recruits whispered, looking at his smoking pistol as if it were some kind of magic talisman. "This changes everything," Walker said, walking up to Hayes. His face was splattered with blood, but his eyes were bright. Hayes didn't answer. He was looking at the dead, at the bodies scattered across the canyon floor. He had wanted vengeance for his men who had died on the Guadalupe. He had wanted to even the odds. But he hadn't expected this. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. He looked at Billy Vance. The boy was reloading his revolver, his hands steady, his face unreadable. He had killed 4 men, maybe 5. He looked up and met Hayes's gaze. "This is what you wanted, isn't it, Captain?" Billy asked, his voice quiet. "This is the new world you were talking about." Before Hayes could reply, a sound made them all turn. From the rocks high above the canyon rim, a lone figure watched them. He was too far away to see clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. A Comanche warrior sitting on his horse, a long lance in his hand. He had seen everything. He had watched the slaughter, had seen the power of the new weapons. He watched them for a long moment, a silent, motionless observer. Then he raised his lance in a gesture that was not a threat, but a promise. He turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. He would carry the story of this day back to Buffalo Hump. The story of the devil guns, of the Rangers who did not need to reload. Hayes holstered his Colt. The barrel was still hot. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the war had not ended here. It had just begun. The Comanche were not a people who would surrender. They would learn. They would adapt. They would find a way to fight back. He swung into his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. The arrow wound in Miller's leg was bleeding again. Hayes ripped a strip of cloth from his own shirt. He leaned down from his horse, his shadow falling over the wounded ranger. "Hold still," Hayes said, his voice rough. He wrapped the cloth tight around the man's thigh, his knuckles brushing against the hot, sticky blood. Chapter 10. They did not stop. Buffalo Hump watched the young warrior seize far, who knelt before the fire. The boy's hands trembled, but his eyes were wide with the truth of what he'd seen. The firelight danced across the tattoos on the chief's chest, pictures of battles won and enemies slain. He had seen 100 winters. He had not seen everything. The white men, the Rangers, Ceasefar said, his voice cracking. They fired their thundersticks, and they did not stop to pour powder. An old warrior named Grey Wolf, whose face was a map of scars, grunted from across the fire circle. The boy was chased by ghosts. His fear makes up stories. I saw Stoneheart fall, Ceasefar insisted, looking at the chief. The one called Hayes fired. Then he fired again. The others, they all kept firing. It was a rolling thunder. Not single cracks like a dry branch breaking. It was a storm. Buffalo Hump held up a hand, and the circle fell silent. He had led the people since before the Texans were a tribe. He knew the difference between fear and fact. He had seen the boy ride into camp, his pony lathered, his face the color of ash. He had seen the truth in his eyes before he'd spoken a word. "Show me," Buffalo Hump said, his voice a low rumble. Ceasefar picked up a stick and drew a shape in the dirt. A long handle, a short barrel. The thunderstick is small. A handgun. But it has a belly that turns. He used his finger to mimic the cylinder rotating. A shot, it turns. Another shot, it turns again. 5 times. 5 times, Grey Wolf scoffed. No gun does this. It is bad medicine. A trick of the light. 20 of our brothers are dead from this trick of the light, Buffalo Hump said, his gaze silencing the old warrior. He looked back at the drawing in the dirt. A gun with a turning belly. He had heard whispers of such things from the Comanchero traders, stories of a man named Colt who made magic. He had dismissed them as tall tales told to drive up the price of rifles. He had been wrong. The world changes, Buffalo Hump said, more to himself than to the others. The buffalo move farther north each year. The grass is thinner. Now the white man's thunderstick has learned to speak without pausing for breath. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the firelight. This is not medicine. It is metal and powder. It is a machine. And any machine can be understood. It can be broken. He looked around the circle, at the faces of his warriors. He saw fear, confusion, and anger. He needed to turn it into purpose. We will not meet them in the open field, he declared. We will not charge into this storm. That is the old way, and the old way is now a path to the grave. We will be the water that flows around the rock. We will be the shadow that they do not see. He pointed a long finger at a warrior who stood apart from the others, a man whose body was lean and hard as dried sinew. His name was Kills in Shadow, and he had earned it. You will take 2 hawks, Buffalo Hump commanded. You will not kill rangers. You will watch them. You will learn their habits. You will wait until one is alone. You will bring him to me, alive. He then looked back at the drawing in the dirt. And you will bring me one of the turning guns. 2 days later, a ranger named Henderson pissed on a patch of prickly pear 100 yards from camp. He was 19 from a farm in Tennessee, and the slaughter at the Box Canyon had made him feel like a god. He and his Colt revolver were invincible. He'd written his mother a letter telling her the Indian Wars would be over by Christmas and he'd be home in time for planting. The sun had set, and the Texas hill country was settling into its nightly rhythm of chirping crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Henderson finished, buttoning his trousers, his new revolver heavy on his hip. He felt a surge of pride. He was a Texas Ranger, a tamer of the wild. He turned to walk back to the comforting glow of the campfire. He never heard them. A hand, hard as stone, clamped over his mouth, stifling his shout. An arm wrapped around his chest, lifting him off his feet. He kicked and struggled, his hand clawing for the pistol on his hip, but another man was already there, unbuckling the gun belt with silent efficiency. A deerskin bag was pulled over his head, plunging him into a world of suffocating darkness and the smell of smoked leather. His feet left the ground. He was thrown over the back of a horse like a sack of feed, and then there was only the jarring rhythm of a pony moving swiftly and silently through the night. When the bag was finally pulled from his head, the moon was high. He was in a small clearing, surrounded by mesquite trees. 2 Comanche warriors stood over him. One was the lean, hard man who had taken his gun. The other was younger, with the sharp eyes of a bird of prey. Kills in Shadow and 2 Hawks. Henderson's hands were tied behind his back. His revolver lay on a flat rock between them, gleaming in the moonlight. Kills in Shadow pointed at the gun. "Show us," he said in broken Spanish, the only tongue they shared. Henderson stared at him, his mouth dry with terror. The godlike feeling was gone, replaced by the cold, certain knowledge that he was going to die. I don't understand." 2 Hawks stepped forward and drew a long, thin knife from his belt. He didn't threaten Henderson with it. He simply used the tip to lightly touch each of the 5 percussion caps on the revolver's cylinder. Then he looked at Henderson. The message was clear. With trembling fingers, Henderson showed them. He explained the caps, the powder, the lead balls. He showed them how to use the rammer to seat the ball, how to cock the hammer, how the cylinder turned with each pull. He tried to lie, to tell them it only worked for white men, that it would explode in their hands. Kills in Shadow listened patiently. When Henderson was done with his lies, 2 Hawks pressed the tip of his knife against the soft skin under Henderson's ear. Not enough to break the skin, just enough to make a point. "Again," Kills in Shadow said. "The truth." Henderson told them the truth. He took the gun apart as best he could with his hands tied, showing them the simple, brutal mechanics of it. He showed them how to remove the empty cylinder and replace it with a pre-loaded one, something Hayes had taught them to do for a faster reload in a long fight. The 2 warriors listened, their dark eyes missing nothing. They passed the weapon back and forth, feeling its weight, testing its action. They were not mystified by it. They were engineers, studying a new piece of machinery. They were predators, learning the weaknesses of a new kind of prey. When they were satisfied, when they had learned everything Henderson could teach them, Kills in Shadow picked up the revolver. He looked from the gun to Henderson, who was now weeping silently, snot and tears running down his face. "You talk too much," Kills in Shadow said in his own language, a language Henderson could not understand. 2 Hawks nodded. He stepped behind the bound ranger. Kills in Shadow turned his back on them both. He looked up at the moon, the stolen Colt heavy in his hand. He needed to get this weapon to Buffalo Hump. He needed to show him how the turning belly worked. He tucked the revolver into his belt and began walking toward his horse. He did not look back. He did not need to. He heard a single wet thump, like an axe splitting a melon. Then silence. Chapter 11. The wood is not worth saving. Nora Vance looked up from the pile of charred timbers that used to be her front wall. The man speaking to her, Ricardo Vargas, had a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He smelled of cologne and cigar smoke, a scent so out of place in the ash and ruin of her tavern that it was offensive. He wore a silk vest under a linen coat, and his boots were polished to a high shine. He looked like he'd stepped out of a different world. "Some of it is," Nora said, pulling a half-burnt plank from the wreckage. The wood was scorched black on one side, but the heartwood was still good. It was something. It was hers. "Senora Vance," Vargas said, his voice smooth as poured molasses. "You are a practical woman. You know when a thing is finished. This town, this life, it is finished." He made a delicate gesture with a manicured hand, encompassing the blackened skeletons of buildings that lined the San Antonio Plaza. The Comancheros sent a message. The Rangers answered. Now the Comanche will send another message. It is a conversation that will not end until everyone is dead. Nora dropped the plank. It landed with a hollow thud, kicking up a cloud of gray ash that settled on her dress. She'd been wearing the same dress for 2 days. It smelled of smoke and fear. "What do you want, Vargas?" "I want to offer you an escape." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though there was no one to hear them but the buzzards circling overhead. "I have a freight business. I run wagons to the coast, to New Orleans, a city of lights and music, where the only savages are the ones who drink too much wine at fancy parties. I'm not looking for a party." "No," he agreed, his dark eyes appraising her. "You are looking for a future. I have a wagon, leaving at dawn tomorrow. There is a place on it for you. No charge. A courtesy from one business owner to another who has suffered a misfortune." Nora looked at him, really looked at him. Ricardo Vargas ran more than just freight. He ran information. He traded with anyone who had coin, be they Texan, Mexican, or Comanchero. He was a vulture who profited from the chaos, and now he was circling her. "Why?" she asked. "Let us call it an investment in goodwill. A beautiful woman like you should not be sweeping up ashes. She should be presiding over a new establishment, in a city where a woman's work is appreciated and protected." The back door of what used to be Mueller's General Store creaked open. Old man Muller, his face smudged with soot, stared at them. His eyes, usually kind, were hard as river stones. "You," Muller said, his voice a low growl. He pointed a trembling finger at Nora. "This is your fault. You brought them here." "I did no such thing, Mr. Muller." "You and your ranger," he spat. "Your Captain Hayes. This is his war. His fight. He brings it to our homes and you welcome him with open arms and whiskey." He took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "Gretchen, my Gretchen, she lost the baby. The shock of the raid." His voice broke. Nora felt the air leave her lungs. Gretchen, who she had saved. The baby. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Sorry don't rebuild my store," Muller said, his grief turning to rage. "It don't bring back my son. You get out. You hear me? You take your ranger's blood money, and you get out of San Antonio." He turned and stumbled back into the ruin of his life, slamming the broken door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. Nora stood frozen, Mueller's words echoing in the quiet plaza. "You see," Vargas said softly, his voice full of false sympathy. "This place is poisoned now. For you. They need someone to blame. You are the easy choice." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "A passenger ticket. New Orleans. A new start. No one knows you. No one blames you for the sins of men who ride with guns." She stared at the ticket. It felt like a lifetime away. A world of gaslights and paved streets, and people who didn't live in constant fear of the horizon. A world without Jack Hayes. "He will not quit," Vargas continued, pressing his advantage. "This Captain Hayes. He has his new guns. He thinks he is a god now. He will ride out and kill more Comanche, and they will ride back and kill more of you. It is a wheel of blood, and you are tied to it." "How do you know so much about his guns?" Nora asked, her voice sharp. Vargas's smile was a fleeting thing. I am a merchant, Senora. It is my business to know what goods are moving through the territory. Word travels. The Comancheros talk of the devil guns. The Rangers talk of them. It is the only thing anyone talks about anymore. He held out the ticket. Don. My wagon waits by the south road. The driver will have your name. He placed the ticket on a blackened barrelhead between them, weighting it down with a small, smooth stone. He gave her one last look, a look that was both pitying and predatory, then turned and walked away, his polished boots leaving sharp prints in the ash. Nora was alone. The sun was setting, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood and orange. She looked at the ticket. A piece of paper that represented a choice. Safety. Anonymity. A life where she didn't have to sleep with a pistol by her bed. She walked through the wreckage of her tavern, into the small back room that had somehow survived the worst of the fire. The roof had collapsed, but the thick adobe walls still stood. Her brother, Billy, had left a wooden crate here before he'd ridden out with Hayes. He'd told her it was insurance. She pried the lid open with a piece of scrap iron. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, lay 2 Colt Patterson revolvers and a dozen pre-loaded cylinders. They were heavy, solid, smelling of gun oil and purpose. They were the cause of all this. The source of the poison. She picked one up. It felt cold and balanced in her hand, a machine made for one thing. She thought of Mueller's face, twisted with grief. She thought of the Comanchero she had shot in the plaza, the surprise on his face as he died. She thought of Jack, riding somewhere out in the chaparral, thinking he was winning a war when all he was doing was making the graves wider. She looked from the revolver in her hand to the ticket sitting on the barrel outside. New Orleans or this? A new life or the old one? Escape or fight? She walked back outside and picked up the ticket. She held it in her hand, the paper flimsy against her calloused skin. She looked at the setting sun, at the long, dark shadows stretching across the ruined plaza. Then she walked back into the shell of her tavern. She found a clean rag and a small can of gun oil she'd salvaged. She sat down on an overturned crate, the heavy revolver in her lap. She ignored the passenger ticket that lay on the dirt floor beside her. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to clean the gun. Chapter 12. It was a clean cut. Sam Walker ran a thumb over the rawhide strip that had bound Henderson's wrists. Too clean. They didn't hack at it. They sliced it. One motion. They took his gun belt the same way. Jack Hayes stared down at what was left of the boy. They'd found him a mile from camp, stuffed under a rock ledge like a forgotten piece of meat. His throat had been cut from ear to ear. The Comanches hadn't scalped him. They hadn't tortured him. They had questioned him, killed him, and left him. It was efficient. It was a message. They know, Hayes said, his voice flat. They know how the guns work. The 10 remaining Rangers stood in a loose, uneasy circle around the body. The morning air was cool, but sweat was trickling down Hayes's back. It wasn't the heat. It was the cold certainty that one of them was a traitor. They knew where to find him, Walker said, his eyes scanning the faces of the other men. Knew he'd be alone. Knew he was the greenest of the bunch, the easiest to break. A ranger named Doyle, a man with shifty eyes and a mouth that was always complaining, spat on the ground. It's the half-breed, he said, nodding toward Billy Vance. He used to ride with them. Probably told them just where to look. Every eye turned to Billy. He stood apart, his face a mask of stone. He didn't deny it. He didn't say a word. He just met Doyle's gaze. Billy's with us, Hayes said, his voice cutting through the tension. But even as he said it, the doubt was there, a snake coiling in his gut. Billy had the knowledge. He had the connections. Is he? Doyle sneered. He shows up out of nowhere, helps us steal the guns, then one of our boys gets his throat slit and his pistol taken. Seems mighty convenient. The Comancheros, who ambushed us in Galveston, knew we were coming, Walker added, his voice low and thoughtful. Someone told them. Someone who was with us. I was with you, Billy said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. So was Doyle. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the other man. Funny thing about Comancheros. They don't pay in promises. They pay in gold. Mexican gold, mostly. Softer than U.S. coin. Doyle's hand drifted toward his belt pouch. It was an unconscious gesture, but Billy saw it. Hayes saw it. You lose something at cards last night, Doyle? Billy asked. What's it to you? Doyle blustered. You paid your debt to Miller with a gold piece, Billy said. I saw it. An old Spanish escudo. The kind the Comancheros favor. Where'd a ranger on government pay get a Spanish escudo? Doyle's face went pale. I won it. In a game. In San Antonio. No, you didn't, said a new voice. It was Miller, the ranger whose leg had been wounded in the canyon fight. He limped forward, leaning on a rifle for support. I asked you where you got it. You said you found it. Doyle looked from Miller to Billy, then to Hayes. He saw no help there. He saw only cold, hard judgment. His shifty eyes darted toward the horses, calculating the distance. He was talking to Santos before the raid in Galveston, Billy said, pressing his advantage. I saw them behind a warehouse. Thought he was just buying whiskey. But he wasn't buying. He was selling. He was selling us. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The Galveston ambush. The dead Rangers. Henderson. It all clicked into place. Doyle made his move. He wasn't a fighter. He was a runner. He spun around and sprinted for the nearest horse, fumbling for the reins. He never made it. Hayes didn't shout. He didn't give an order. He simply drew his Colt. The motion was fluid, economical. The hammer clicked back. The shot was deafening in the morning quiet. Doyle pitched forward as if he'd tripped, a dark hole appearing in the back of his homespun shirt. He landed face down in the dust, his fingers still twitching, reaching for a horse that was now a lifetime away. Silence. The Rangers stared at Doyle's body, then at Hayes. He stood with the revolver still extended, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. His face was granite. This wasn't a trial. This wasn't justice as they knew it. This was a reckoning. He sold us out, Hayes said, his voice devoid of emotion. He got Henderson killed. He would have gotten us all killed. He walked over to Doyle's body and nudged it with his boot. He knelt and pulled the man's belt pouch free. He upended it. A half-dozen silver coins and 2 Spanish gold escudos fell into the dust. No one spoke. The proof was there, glittering in the morning sun. Hayes stood up. He looked at each of his men, his gaze lingering for a moment on Billy Vance. He saw shock, fear, and a new terrible kind of respect. They understood the new rules. There were no rules. There was only survival, and betrayal was a disease that had to be cut out before it spread. Walker, Hayes said, his voice rasping. Get a shovel. We bury our own. We leave him for the buzzards. Walker nodded, his face grim. He turned to go. Billy Vance stepped forward. He looked at Hayes, then at the smoking Colt still in his captain's hand. You didn't know, Billy said. It wasn't a question. If I hadn't seen that coin, you would have thought it was me. Maybe, Hayes admitted. The snake of doubt was dead, but he could still feel its phantom chill. But you did see it. That's what matters. Hayes holstered his revolver. The warm steel slid into the cool leather. He turned his back on Doyle's body and walked toward his horse. The sun was climbing, and they had miles to cover. The Comanche had one of their guns now. They were learning. They were adapting. And they would be coming. He swung into the saddle, the leather groaning under his weight. He didn't look back at the men or at the body lying in the dust. He looked at the horizon. He looked toward the war that was waiting for them. He kicked his horse, and the animal moved forward, its hooves kicking up small puffs of dust from the dry Texas earth. One by one, the other rangers mounted and followed, leaving the traitor behind. Chapter 13. They're gone. Miller shifted his weight, his wounded thigh still a dull ache. It's been 4 days. We ain't cut a single track. It's like they fell off the earth. They didn't fall, Sam Walker said, squinting at the horizon. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the baked earth and scrubby mesquite. They pulled back. They're thinking. That's worse. Jack Hayes didn't say anything. He was listening to the silence. After the canyon fight, he'd expected pursuit. He'd expected a running battle all the way to the Red River. Instead, he'd found nothing. An empty landscape that felt more dangerous than an army of warriors. The Comanche had seen the Colts. They had stolen one. And then they had vanished. Water's low, Billy Vance said, shaking his canteen. It made a hollow, sloshing sound. Horses are feeling it. They rode on, 9 rangers chasing ghosts through a country that wanted them dead. The confidence they'd gained in the Box Canyon had evaporated under the relentless sun, replaced by a gnawing unease. The revolvers on their hips felt heavy, useless. You couldn't shoot the heat. You couldn't put a bullet in the thirst. Late in the afternoon, they found it. A small seep at the base of a rock outcropping, surrounded by a patch of impossibly green grass. A trickle of clear water pooled in a shallow basin of stone. Well, hallelujah, Miller breathed. Walker pulled his horse up short. He scanned the rim of the outcropping, his eyes narrowed. I don't like it, he said. What's not to like? Miller gestured at the water. It's a goddamn miracle. It's too easy, Walker said. This is the only water for 20 miles. They know we'd have to come here. It's a perfect spot for an ambush. Hayes surveyed the terrain. Walker was right. The rocks offered a dozen places to hide. But their canteens were nearly empty, and the horses were starting to stumble. We post guards, Hayes said, making the decision. Billy, you and Miller take the high ground. Watch our backs. The rest of us will get the horses watered. We don't stay long. As the thirsty horses crowded around the small pool, the world exploded. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't a war cry. It was sound. A hellish, rattling cacophony that erupted from the rocks all around them. Dozens of Comanche hidden on the high ground, shaking gourd rattles filled with pebbles, beating small drums, creating a wave of noise designed to terrify animals. The horses screamed. Their eyes rolled back in their heads, white with panic. The disciplined mounts of the Texas Rangers dissolved into a herd of terrified beasts. A big roan belonging to a ranger named Cates reared up, knocking its rider from the saddle, and bolted. The panic was contagious. In seconds, the entire remuda was a churning, unstoppable mass of horseflesh. Get clear, Walker yelled, diving behind a boulder. Hayes tried to hold onto his mare's reins, but the animal was insane with fear. She ripped the leather from his grasp, burning his palms, and plunged into the stampede. It was over in a minute. The thunder of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind a trampled patch of grass a spilled canteen, and a thick cloud of dust. And 9 men on foot. "Everyone sound off," Hayes shouted, his voice hoarse. Walker was there. Billy and Miller scrambled down from the rocks. The other 4 rangers picked themselves up from the dirt, bruised and shaken. "Where's Kate's?" Walker asked. They found him 20 yards away, half buried in the churned-up earth. A hoof had caught him in the side of the head. His neck was bent at an angle that wasn't natural. "Christ," someone whispered. They stood there, 9 men in the middle of nowhere, their horses gone, one of their own dead. The silence that followed the stampede was more terrifying than the noise had been. "They didn't fire a shot," Billy said, his voice full of a terrible understanding. "They didn't have to. They buried Kate's in a shallow grave, piling rocks on top to keep the coyotes from digging him up. Then they took stock. They had their revolvers, their rifles, and what little water was left in their canteens. They were 50 miles from the nearest settlement, in the heart of Comanche territory." "We walk," Hayes said. "We head east. We walk at night when it's cooler." They waited until dusk. The body of their dead comrade, a grim reminder of their new vulnerability. The Comanche were still out there, watching. They knew the rangers were on foot now, tired and exposed. The attack came 2 hours after moonrise. They were crossing a flat, open piece of ground when the first arrow hissed out of the darkness. It took a ranger named Pierce in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain. "Down," Hayes yelled, dropping to one knee and drawing his Colt. But there was nothing to shoot at. The darkness was absolute. They formed a tight circle, back to back, their revolvers scanning the night. Another arrow. This one thudded into the dirt near Walker's feet. "They're toying with us," Walker growled, his knuckles white where he gripped his pistol. "They're testing us," Hayes corrected. "Seeing what we'll do." For an hour, it was a war of nerves. An arrow would fly out of the night, from a different direction each time. The rangers would spin and fire at the sound, their muzzle flashes briefly illuminating an empty landscape. They were wasting ammunition, shooting at ghosts. Then the ghosts attacked. They didn't charge. They rushed. 4 warriors, seeming to materialize out of the ground itself, sprinted at the circle of rangers. They carried not rifles, but war clubs and knives. The rangers' revolvers roared, a ragged volley in the dark. 2 of the attackers went down. But the other 2 were already inside the circle. A ranger screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut off abruptly. Hayes turned to see the man go down, a war club buried in his skull. He shot the Comanche who had killed him, the bullet catching the warrior in the chest and sending him stumbling backward into the darkness. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The fight had lasted 10 seconds. They were left with the ringing in their ears, the smell of gunpowder, and another dead ranger. Hayes knelt beside the fallen man, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked out into the impenetrable darkness. The Comanche hadn't tried to overrun them. They hadn't engaged in a stand-up fight where the Colts would be decisive. They had used the land. They had used the night. They had used the Rangers' own fear against them. Buffalo Hump was learning. He was changing the rules. He wasn't fighting the guns anymore. He was fighting the men. And he was winning. Hayes stood up, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. They were a perfect target. They couldn't run. They were on foot. He looked at the tall, dry prairie grass surrounding them. It was a sea of blackness, a perfect hiding place for 100 warriors. An idea, born of desperation, took root. Hayes turned to Billy Vance. "Your tinderbox," he said, his voice a low command. "Give it to me." Chapter 14. You want to do what? Sam Walker stared at Hayes, as if he'd just suggested they all lie down and die. Billy Vance held the tinderbox, his hand frozen midway to his captain. The grass is dry as a bone, Hayes said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. It'll go up like a torch. It'll give us light. It'll give us a wall. It'll burn us alive, Miller said from the ground, clutching his wounded leg. And it'll show every Comanche for 100 miles exactly where we are. They already know where we are, Hayes snapped. He pointed out into the blackness, where another arrow had just thudded into the dirt. They're out there picking us off one by one. I'd rather face them in the light than die in the dark. He snatched the tinderbox from Billy's hand. We moved toward the creek. If the fire gets too close, we use the water. Now, get ready to run. He knelt, struck the flint against the steel. A spark caught in the small ball of char cloth. He blew on it gently, nurturing the tiny orange ember. Then he touched it to a handful of dry grass. The fire didn't start. It exploded. A whoosh of sound and a wave of heat washed over them as a wall of flame erupted from the prairie floor. The dry grass ignited with a furious crackle, turning the night from absolute black to blinding orange. In the sudden, hellish light, they could see them. Dozens of Comanche warriors, caught by surprise, their painted faces illuminated in the flickering glare. They had been creeping closer, preparing for another rush. "Run!" Hayes yelled, grabbing the wounded Pierce by the arm and hauling him to his feet. They ran. The fire was at their backs, a roaring beast that consumed the prairie behind them. The heat was immense, scorching their skin, the smoke thick and acrid in their lungs. They stumbled through the smoke, half blind, their shadows dancing like giant misshapen demons in the firelight. But the plan was working. The Comanche, masters of the dark, were thrown into chaos by the sudden inferno. Their horses, tethered nearby, whinnied in terror. The warriors fell back from the heat, their stealthy encircling attack broken. The rangers ran for nearly a mile, the fire chasing them, guiding them. The wind was at their backs, pushing the wall of flame faster than a man could walk. It was a desperate, terrifying race. "The creek," Walker shouted, pointing ahead. Through the smoke, they could see the dark line of Plum Creek, a shallow, muddy stream bordered by a steep-sided ravine. It wasn't much, but it was a fire break. It was safety. They scrambled down the rocky embankment, their boots slipping on the loose shale. They splashed into the cool water, dousing the smoking embers on their clothes, gulping the silty water into their parched throats. They were 7 men left now, huddled in a ravine, the world around them on fire. The fire reached the creek bank and slowed, the flames licking at the damp earth, unable to cross. The roaring subsided to a steady, hungry crackle. "We made it," Pierce gasped, collapsing against the ravine wall. Billy Vance was looking up, his eyes scanning the opposite rim of the ravine, which was now silhouetted against the glowing red sky. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "We didn't." They appeared like apparitions against the firelight. A line of mounted warriors on the far side of the creek, and more on the rim above them, the side they had just descended. They hadn't been driven off by the fire. They had used it. They had funneled the running rangers exactly where they wanted them. Into a trap. "They herded us," Walker said, his voice filled with a grim understanding. He drew his Colt, the metal cool against his skin. "They drove us right into the slaughter pen." The ravine was maybe 30 yards wide. The walls were steep, offering good cover, but there was no way out. They were pinned down. The first wave came from across the creek. 20 warriors on foot, splashing through the shallow water, their war cries sharp and piercing under the blood-red sky. They came on in a rush, confident, knowing the rangers were trapped and outnumbered. "Hold your fire," Hayes commanded, his voice echoing in the narrow space. The Rangers flattened themselves against the rock wall, using boulders and crevices for cover. Let them get close. Make every shot count. The Comanche charged into the ravine, their faces grim masks of war paint in the fiery light. They were halfway across the creek bed when Hayes stood. Now, he roared. 7 Colt revolvers opened up at once. The contained space of the ravine amplified the sound into a continuous, deafening thunder. It wasn't a volley. It was a sustained, rolling barrage of lead. The charging warriors were stunned by the volume of fire. They had expected a single blast, then a frantic reload. They got a storm. Men in the front of the charge were punched off their feet, their bodies jerking as multiple bullets hit them at once. A warrior with a tomahawk raised over his head took a round in the chest from Walker's pistol, spun, and took another in the back from Miller's. He fell face first into the muddy water. The charge faltered. The warriors, so confident a moment before, now hesitated, looking for cover that wasn't there. They were caught in a killing field, 35 rounds of .36 caliber lead, tearing through their ranks in less than 30 seconds. The first wave broke. The survivors scrambled back across the creek, dragging their wounded, leaving a dozen of their dead and dying brothers lying in the water. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the ravine, broken only by the crackle of the prairie fire and the groans of a wounded Comanche. "Reload," Hayes ordered, his hands already moving, expertly swapping the empty cylinder of his Colt for a full one. "They'll be back." He looked at his men. Their faces were blackened with smoke and gunpowder, their eyes wide with the savage thrill of the fight. They were trapped, outnumbered, and on the verge of annihilation. But for the first time in days, they weren't running. They were fighting. From the rim of the canyon above, a new sound began. A low, rhythmic chanting. It was Buffalo Hump himself, directing the battle, calling his warriors for the next attack. They had lost the element of surprise, but they still had the numbers. They still held the high ground. Hayes slammed the fresh cylinder into his revolver. He looked across the creek, at the shadowy figures of the Comanche regrouping, then up at the dark shapes on the canyon rim. He was out of ideas. He was out of tricks. All he had left was the gun in his hand. He raised the Colt, cocked the hammer, and aimed into the darkness where the next wave would come. The heavy pistol felt steady in his grip, an anchor in the chaos. He took a breath, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning grass. The chanting grew louder. Chapter 15. The man who rode into San Antonio wasn't the same one who'd ridden out. Jack Hayes sat his horse, a borrowed army mount, and looked at the ruin of the plaza. He had 5 men left. 5 out of the 12 who had ridden out full of piss and confidence, thinking 5-shot revolvers made them immortal. The victory at Plum Creek felt like a fever dream. They'd held the ravine, a wall of fire at their back, and their rolling thunder had broken wave after wave of Comanche attacks. They'd held on until a cavalry patrol out of Austin, drawn by the glow of the burning prairie, had stumbled upon the battle and sent the warriors scattering. They'd won, but it felt like losing. He had 2 new holes in his left leg where an arrow had pinned him to his saddle, and his ears still rang from the continuous gunfire. Walker had a broken arm. Miller would limp for the rest of his life. They had left 4 more of their own dead in that muddy creek bed. He dismounted in front of what used to be Nora's tavern. The front wall was gone, the roof a skeleton of charred beams open to the sky. But the place wasn't abandoned. A canvas tarp had been stretched over part of the opening, creating a makeshift shelter. Barrels of water stood by the doorway. The smell wasn't just of ash, but of lye soap and cooking beans. Nora came out from under the tarp. She wasn't wearing a calico dress. She wore a man's work shirt and canvas trousers, her hair tied back with a leather thong. There was a pistol tucked into her belt. Not the little pepper box he'd given her. This was a Colt. One of the ones he'd left behind. She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She looked at him, at his 5 remaining men, and her face was hard. "You're bleeding on the porch," she said. "It'll wash out." He limped toward her, the pain in his leg a sharp, insistent thing. "I heard what happened here." "Heard?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "You didn't hear the screaming, Jack. You didn't smell the smoke. You just heard a story." She turned and went back inside. "There's coffee, if you're not too proud to drink it in a ruin." He followed her into the tavern. The main room was a disaster, but the back, where the adobe walls were thickest, had been cleared. Pallets and blankets were laid out on the floor. An old woman was tending to a sick child in the corner. This wasn't a tavern anymore. It was a refuge. Nora handed him a tin cup of coffee. Her hands were rough, her knuckles scraped. "Gretchen Muller lost the baby," she said, not looking at him. "Old man Muller thinks I'm the devil's wife. Most of the town agrees with him." "It wasn't your fault, Nora. Wasn't it?" She finally met his eyes, and what he saw there made him take a step back. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. "Your war came to my town, Jack. Your enemies burned my home. I had to kill a man. Right out there, in the plaza. Shot him in the back while he was threatening Gretchen. Does that sound like it wasn't my fault?" He had no answer. He just drank his coffee. It was bitter. "I'm staying," she said, the words sharp and clear. "I'm not running to New Orleans. I'm not letting them chase me out. I'm going to rebuild this place, board by board." He felt a surge of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees. "I'm glad to hear it. I didn't say I was staying for you." She took a breath, and it seemed to steady her. "I have a proposition. A deal. You want me here when you get back from whatever fresh hell you're riding into next. Then you make me a promise." "What promise?" "When this is over. When you've killed Buffalo Hump, or run him out of Texas. When you've decided you've won. You're done. You take off that ranger badge, you hang up your gun, and you stay. You help me run this tavern. You live a life. Here. With me." He stared at her. The steam from his coffee cup rose between them. He thought of the warriors who had gotten away from Plum Creek. He thought of Buffalo Hump, wounded but alive, his hatred now honed to a razor's edge. He thought of the stolen Colt, and the Comanche who were, even now, taking it apart, learning its secrets. "Nora, the war isn't a single battle," he began. "It's not over just because." "I'm not negotiating," she cut him off. "This isn't a debate. It's the price. You want me? That's the price. A life. Not a war." He looked around the ruined room, at the sick child, at the pistol on Nora's hip. He looked at her face, so hard and determined, and he knew he had lost her somewhere back in the smoke and the killing. He had taught her that the only thing you could count on was the gun in your hand, and she had learned the lesson too well. "I can't," he said, the words tasting like defeat. "I can't make that promise. It's not over. It won't be over for a long time." She didn't cry. Her face didn't change. She simply nodded, as if he had just confirmed something she already knew. Then she slapped him. It wasn't a hysterical gesture. It was a hard, deliberate strike that cracked across the quiet room and snapped his head to the side. The sting was sharp, but the shock was sharper. She looked at her hand, then back at him. "I buried 3 of my neighbors last week," she said, her voice a dead-level calm. "I held Gretchen Mueller's hand while she bled out her future. "Don't you ever again tell me what this war is, or when it will be over." She turned and walked away from him, pushing aside the canvas tarp and stepping out into the harsh sunlight of the plaza, leaving him alone in the wreckage. He stood there for a long moment, the side of his face burning, the tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He looked at the Colt on his hip, the weapon that had saved his life at Plum Creek. The weapon that had just cost him his. Chapter 16. They call you Diablo Jack now. Billy Vance watched Hayes trace a line on a worn map of Bexar County. The map was spread across a crate in the livery stable, the only place in San Antonio that didn't look at them with either fear or hatred. The air was thick with the smell of hay and horse manure. It was better than the smell of smoke. "The Mexicans do," Billy continued. "They say you ride with a gun that never runs empty and you can't be killed." "Tell that to Cates," Hayes said without looking up. "Tell it to Pierce." Sam Walker sat on a hay bale, his arm in a dirty sling, trying to roll a cigarette with one hand. "It's not just the Mexicans. We tried to recruit from the garrison." The captain practically pissed himself. Said he wasn't letting any of his men ride with a man who has a Comanche death sentence on his head. "So no new men," Hayes said. "It wasn't a question." "We got 3, Walker said, finally getting the cigarette rolled. "It was lumpy and misshapen. A dirt farmer who lost his family last year, and 2 drifters who think ranger pay is better than starving. They ain't shooters. They're just warm bodies." "We're not a company anymore," Billy said quietly. "We're a posse. And we're being hunted." Hayes finally looked up from the map. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn tight over the bones. The wound in his leg had closed up, but he moved with a stiffness that wasn't there before. The slap from Nora still burned on his cheek, a phantom sting that reminded him of everything he'd lost. "He's gathering them," Hayes said. "Every band from the Brazos to the Llano Estacado. He's not going to raid a settlement. He's not going to hit a wagon train. He's coming for us. He's coming for the guns." "Let him come," Walker growled, lighting his cigarette. "We beat him at Plum Creek with 7 men. We can do it again." "He won't fight us at a creek," Hayes said. "He's learned. He'll pick the ground. He'll have the numbers. And he's had a month to study Henderson's Colt." The silence that followed was heavy. They all saw the image, the Comanche masters of imitation taking the revolver apart, figuring out its secrets, crafting a strategy to defeat it. "So what's the plan, Jack?" Walker asked, his bravado gone, his voice low and serious. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to burn the town down around us." Hayes folded the map. "No," he said. "We don't wait." The fire was the heart of the camp. It beat against the coming night, a pulse of light and heat that drew them in. From the north they came, the Penatica, the people of the honey. From the west, the Quahati, the antelope eaters fierce and proud. From the south, the Katsoteca, the buffalo eaters. 200 warriors. 300. More arriving with every sunset. They came not for a raid, but for a war. Buffalo Hump stood on a rise overlooking the vast encampment. The stolen Colt revolver was tucked into his belt. He had spent weeks with it. He had fired it until the caps were gone. He had taken it apart, piece by piece, laying the intricate guts of the machine on a buffalo hide. He understood it now. Kills in shadow stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the sea of campfires below. "They are afraid," Kills in shadow said. "The stories of Plum Creek have made their hearts small." "Fear is a tool," Buffalo Hump replied, his hand resting on the walnut grip of the Colt. "It sharpens the mind. They are not afraid of the Rangers. They are afraid of this." He drew the revolver. It felt both powerful and clumsy in his hand. It was a white man's weapon. Heavy. Complicated. It needed special food, the little copper caps, the measured powder. It was not like a bow, which was an extension of a man's own arm. "It is slow," Buffalo Hump said. "To feed, it takes many moments. A warrior with a bow can send 6 arrows while a ranger feeds his gun one time. But in the first moments," Kills in Shadow countered, "the gun speaks 5 times. In the first moments, many men can die." "Yes." Buffalo Hump nodded. "The first moments. That is the key." He turned to his warrior. "The white man thinks this gun is his strength. He will ride into our trap because he trusts the gun more than he trusts his own eyes. He will see what he expects to see." His plan was simple. It was brutal. It was a lie. He would send a small raiding party, a decoy, to attack a settlement near Walker's Creek, the place where the Rangers had first been broken. Hayes, hearing the news, would ride there. He would expect an ambush. He would be cautious. He would scout the terrain. And while Hayes was looking for 100 warriors in the canyons of Walker's Creek, Buffalo Hump and 300 more would be riding hard for San Antonio. Not to burn it this time, but to take it, to occupy the old mission, to hold the white man's stone fortress, to force Hayes to come to him, to force him to attack a fortified position, to make the Rangers' charge break against stone walls, where the 5-shot revolvers would be useless against warriors firing from cover. He would turn the white man's strength into his weakness. He would make the Rangers the ones charging into a storm of death. "The men are ready," Kills in Shadow said. "They ask only to know the day." Buffalo Hump looked up at the moon, a sliver of silver in the dark sky. "When the moon is full, we ride. Tell them to paint their faces for war. Tell them to make their medicine strong. We are not fighting for horses or plunder. We are fighting for the land. We are fighting for the sky. We are fighting for the end of the world." He slid the Colt back into his belt. It was a cold, alien weight against his skin. A poison he had to swallow to defeat his enemies. He would use their weapon, their tactics, their own arrogance against them. And when it was over, he would melt the devil gun down in a great fire and scatter its ashes to the 4 winds. He would cleanse the land of its memory. He turned and walked back toward his lodge. The low thrum of hundreds of war drums began to rise from the valley below, a slow, steady heartbeat that shook the very ground beneath his feet. Chapter 17. Rider Coming. The words from the new recruit, the dirt farmer, were tight with fear. Jack Hayes looked up from cleaning his revolver. A lone figure on a spotted pony was approaching their camp from the south, moving at a slow, deliberate walk. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't sneaking. He was announcing himself. "Just one?" Sam Walker asked, his good hand resting on the butt of his Colt. His broken arm was still in a sling, a constant aching reminder of Plum Creek. "Just one," the farmer confirmed. "But he's Comanche." The camp went silent. The 8 Rangers stopped what they were doing, mending tack, sharpening knives, hoarding the last of their coffee. They watched the rider get closer. He carried a single lance, but held it butt down, the point to the sky, a sign of peace. Or a trick. With Comanche, it was usually a trick. He stopped his pony 100 yards out, just beyond rifle range. He raised an open hand. He sat there, waiting. "What the hell does he want?" Miller muttered. "He wants to talk," Hayes said, standing up. He slid his clean revolver into its holster. "Billy Walker. With me." The 3 of them walked out to meet the rider, the dry grass crunching under their boots. The Comanche watched them approach. He was a man of about 40, his face a mask of old scars and new grief. One of his hands was maimed, the fingers twisted into a claw. "You are the one they call Diablo, Jack?" the warrior asked when they were 20 paces away. He spoke a rough, halting Spanish. "I'm Hayes," Jack said. "Who are you?" "My name is Broken Hand." He gestured with his maimed hand. "I have come to speak of the future." "I'm not interested in fortunes," Hayes said, his eyes hard. "State your business or ride out." "My business is the business of all men who wish to see another sunrise," Broken Hand said. "Buffalo Hump has gathered the people. He has studied your turning gun. He knows its strengths. And he knows its weaknesses." Walker shifted his weight. "Get to the point." "The point," Broken Hand said, his dark eyes fixing on Hayes, "is that he is going to kill you all. But not in the way you think. He is a hunter. He knows you are a wolf. And he will not fight the wolf in its den." Hayes felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was no simple parley. This was something else. "What are you telling me?" "He will send 30 warriors, led by a young fool named Tall Elk. They will burn the Fisher homestead, near Walker's Creek. They will make much smoke. They will draw you out." Broken Hand leaned forward on his pony. "He knows you will come. You are proud. You will ride to the sound of the guns. You will expect a trap, like at Plum Creek. You will look for 100 warriors, hiding in the rocks. And," Hayes prompted, his voice dangerously quiet, "and while you are looking for them in the canyons of the creek, Buffalo Hump and 300 warriors will be riding for San Antonio. He will not burn the town this time. He will take it. He will put his men in the old mission, behind the stone walls. He will wait for you to come to him. He will make you charge his fortress. He will make your turning guns useless." The silence that followed was absolute. The plan was brilliant. It was a perfect reversal. It used the Rangers' own strength, their reputation, against them. It turned the hunters into the hunted, the saviors into the damned. "Why?" Walker finally asked, his voice a low growl. "Why are you telling us this? A man doesn't sell out his own chief for nothing." Broken Hand's gaze dropped. For the first time, the warrior's hard facade cracked, revealing the raw grief beneath. "Tall Elk, the one who leads the decoy raid, he is my son. My only son. He is young and full of fire. He believes in the chief. He believes in the glory of this war." He looked back at Hayes, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, pleading light. "Buffalo Hump is sending him to die. He knows you will kill them all at the creek. He is sacrificing my son and 29 others to set his trap for you. He is watering the ground with the blood of our children to grow a victory for his own pride." Billy Vance, who had been silent, spoke up. "You're not trying to save us. You're trying to save your son." "I am trying to save what is left of the people," Broken Hand corrected, his voice ragged with emotion. "This war will be our end. The chief is blind. He sees only the battles. He does not see the graves. If he takes San Antonio, the white soldiers will come. Not rangers. Soldiers. With cannons. They will tear the mission down stone by stone. They will not stop until every one of us is gone. I do this so that some of us might live." Hayes stared at the man, weighing the story. It had the bitter ring of truth. It was a story of pride and loss, something he understood all too well. Doyle's betrayal had been for gold. This felt different. This was for survival. "If we ride to the creek," Walker said, thinking it through, "San Antonio falls. If we stay in San Antonio, the Fisher family gets slaughtered, and we look like cowards who ran from a fight." It was an impossible choice. A perfect trap. Hayes looked at the scarred, grieving warrior. He saw a man pushed to the very edge, willing to betray everything he knew to save the one thing he had left. Hayes knew that feeling. He lived with it every day. He made his decision. He turned his back on Broken Hand. He looked at Billy Vance, his eyes locking with the younger man's. "Billy," he said, his voice low and urgent, the words coming fast. "You're the best rider we have. I want you to get on your horse, and I want you to ride. Don't stop for water, don't stop for rest. You ride like your soul is on fire. You get to San Antonio." "And do what?" Billy asked, his eyes wide. "There's nothing there. A few old men and a burnt-out plaza." "You find your sister," Hayes commanded. "You tell her I was wrong. You tell her the war is coming to her door, and I am not there to stop it. You tell her to take every man, woman, and child and get them inside the mission. Bar the doors. Get every rifle, every pistol, every ounce of powder and lead she can find onto those walls. You tell her Buffalo Hump is coming to take her home from her." He let that sink in for a second, then he turned to Walker. His voice was cold now, hard as flint. "Sam, get the men ready to ride." Walker looked confused. "Ride where?" "To San Antonio." Hayes shook his head, a grim, terrible smile touching his lips. He looked toward the west, toward the tangled canyons of Walker's Creek, the place of his first great defeat. "No," he said. "We're going hunting." Chapter 18. He said what? Nora stared at her brother. Billy Vance looked like he'd been dragged behind his horse, all the way from the New Waysea Strip. His face was caked with dust, his lips cracked and bleeding. He'd slid from his saddle and practically fallen into her arms, his horse shuddering with exhaustion behind him. "He's not coming," Billy repeated, his voice a dry rasp. He gulped water from the dipper she'd handed him, spilling half of it down his chin. He took the rest of the men and rode for Walker's Creek. "He said to tell you the war is coming to your door. He said to get everyone inside the mission." Nora took the dipper from him. Her hand was steady. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. "He's using us," she said, the words tasting like poison. "He's using this town as bait. He's leaving us here to die so he can fight his battle." "No," Billy said, shaking his head. "He's drawing them off. He's going after the decoy party. He's trying to buy you time." "Time for what?" "To pray?" She looked around the ruined plaza. A handful of families had taken shelter in the wreckage of the church and her tavern. Old Man Muller was trying to board up the windows of his store with fire-warped planks. They were a town of ghosts, waiting for the real ghosts to come and finish the job. "Time to fight," Billy said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 extra Colt revolvers and a canvas sack heavy with pre-loaded cylinders. He said to get every gun you could find. He said to tell you he was wrong. The last words hung in the air between them. Nora turned away, refusing to let him see the effect they had on her. Wrong. The word was a decade too late and 1,000 miles short. "Muller won't listen to me," she said, her voice flat. "None of them will. They blame me. They blame Jack." "Then you make them listen," Billy said, his own exhaustion giving way to a hard-edged urgency. "You've got about 24 hours before 300 warriors who've been promised this town as a prize come riding over that hill. They won't care who you blame then." She found Muller by his store, his hammer blows echoing in the quiet plaza. He stopped when he saw her, his face a mask of grief and hatred. "Get away from my place," he growled. "Mr. Muller," Nora said, her voice even. "In 1 day, maybe less, a Comanche war party is going to be right where you're standing. They are not coming to raid. They are coming to stay." Let them come, he spat. Can't be any worse than having you and your ranger friends around. Nora pulled the Colt from her belt. The motion was smooth, practiced. She didn't point it at him. She just held it. I am not your friend, Mr. Muller. And I am not the cause of your problems. But I am the only one who is going to keep your scalp on your head. Now, you can take your hammer and your bitterness, and you can die with them, or you can get every able-bodied man and woman you can find, and meet me at the mission in 5 minutes. We're going to turn it into a fortress. Muller stared at the gun, then at her face. He saw no fear there. He saw no apology. He saw the same cold fire that had been in Jack Hayes's eyes. He dropped his hammer. It wasn't enough. They had maybe 20 rifles in the whole town, and a handful of pistols. The mission walls were thick, but the main gate was old wood. They needed more. They needed the Army's ammunition. The San Antonio garrison was a joke. A fat captain named Bullock and 30 men who spent most of their time sleeping off cheap whiskey. Their armory, however, was not a joke. It held 2 crates of Army-issue rifle cartridges and a barrel of black powder. Captain Bullock refused. My orders are to protect government property, he said, his chins wobbling with indignation. He stood on the porch of his small office, blocking the door. I can't just issue munitions to civilians. There are regulations. There are 300 Comanche on their way to burn your regulations, Nora said, Billy at her side. I have received no official report of such a threat, Bullock puffed. Until I do, this armory remains sealed. Nora looked at Billy. Billy looked at her. They hadn't discussed a plan. They didn't need to. Billy sighed dramatically. Well, Captain, you're the boss. He turned as if to leave, then spun back around, his fist connecting with Bullock's third chin. The captain went down with a surprised grunt, like a hog that had been poleaxed. 2 young sentries, who had been watching with wide eyes, fumbled for their rifles. Before they could bring them up, Nora had her Colt out. Boys, she said, her voice calm. You have 2 choices. You can be heroes and die for a man who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire. Or you can help us load that ammunition into Mr. Mueller's wagon and live to see another day. You might even get to shoot a few of the men who are coming to kill your mothers. The boys looked at each other, then at the unconscious captain wheezing on the porch. They lowered their rifles. Nora didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a leader. She felt like a thief. She was becoming Jack Hayes. She was using threats and violence to get what she wanted, all for the greater good. She hated him for it. And she hated that he was right. Walker's Creek was a scar on the land. A place of ghosts. Hayes could feel them as he positioned his 6 men. The ghosts of the Rangers he'd lost here before, in his first command, his first bloody lesson in Comanche warfare. They'll come down this draw, he said to Walker, pointing to a narrow cut in the canyon wall. It's the easiest way to the Fisher place. They'll be moving fast, thinking about the raid, not about their flanks. He wasn't setting a simple ambush. He was building a machine. A killing machine made of 7 men. He put Walker and Miller on the east rim of the draw, hidden in a thicket of scrub oak. He put the 3 new men on the west rim, behind a line of boulders. He and Billy would stay mobile in the creek bed itself, acting as the hammer. They'll see the men on the west rim first, Hayes explained, his voice a low whisper. They'll charge them, thinking it's the main force. That's when you open up from the east, Sam. A crossfire. You'll have them pinned. Billy and I will come up from behind and close the door. It was a good plan. It was a vicious plan. It relied on turning the narrow draw into a 30-second hurricane of lead from 3 directions. "What about Broken Hand's son?" Walker asked. "The one this is all for." "We don't know what he looks like," Hayes said, his face grim. "We don't know which one he is. We shoot who's in front of us. We kill them all. That's the only way this works. It's the only way San Antonio has a chance." They waited. The sun beat down. The rocks grew hot to the touch. The ghosts of the canyon whispered on the wind. Hayes felt the familiar knot of fear and anticipation tighten in his gut. He checked his Colt for the 10th time. Then his backup revolver. Every cylinder was loaded. Every cap was in place. Hours passed. The shadows grew long. Then a thin column of black smoke rose from the south. The Fisher homestead. Hayes looked at Walker across the canyon and nodded once. He looked at the new men, their faces pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Billy, who met his gaze with a steady, unnerving calm. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer cocking unnaturally loud in the silence. Down the draw, he could hear the first faint drumming of unshod ponies. They were coming. Chapter 19. There they are. The farmer's voice was a dry whisper. He lay behind a boulder on the west rim of the draw, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. Hayes, hidden in the creek bed below, didn't need the warning. He could feel the ground vibrating, a low thrum that traveled through the soles of his boots. 30 riders poured into the mouth of the draw. They were painted for war, a river of ochre and black, their ponies moving at a ground-eating trot. They were confident. They had burned a homestead, and no one had challenged them. Now they rode through the canyon, heading for home, for glory. The warrior in the lead wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down his back. He rode a powerful black and white paint, and he sat the horse with the easy arrogance of a man who had never known defeat. "That's him," Billy Vance murmured from beside Hayes. "That has to be Tall Elk." He looked exactly as his father had described him, young, full of fire, and riding straight to his grave. Tall Elk's eyes scanned the canyon. He was a good warrior. He was cautious. His gaze swept the east rim, lingering for a moment on the thicket of scrub oak where Walker and Miller were hidden. He saw nothing. His eyes moved to the west rim. The farmer shifted his weight. A small pebble dislodged from under his boot and skittered down the rock face. It was enough. Tall Elk saw the movement. He saw the glint of a rifle barrel. He let out a piercing war cry, a signal to his men. He had found the ambushers. He pointed his lance at the west rim and kicked his paint horse into a full gallop. "Here it comes," Hayes said, his voice calm. The Comanche charged. They swarmed toward the west rim. A wave of 30 warriors focused on the 3 men Hayes had placed there as bait. The farmer and the 2 drifters did as they were told. They opened fire. Their 3 shots were a pathetic pop, pop, pop against the thunder of hooves. A warrior went down, his pony tumbling head over heels. But the others kept coming. They were 100 yards away. 50. They knocked arrows to their bows, their faces masks of triumphant fury. They were about to overrun the foolish white men who had dared to stand against them. "Now, Sam," Hayes whispered into the wind. From the east rim, a wall of sound erupted. Walker and Miller stood up from their hiding place and unleashed hell. Their 2 Colts sounded like 10 in the narrow draw. Lead tore into the flank of the charging Comanche. Horses screamed and went down. Warriors, who had been focused on the charge ahead, were ripped from their saddles by an enemy they hadn't seen. The charge dissolved into chaos. The Comanche were caught in a perfect crossfire. Bullets from the west, bullets from the east. The draw became a meat grinder. Tall Elk wheeled his horse around, his face a mask of confusion. His perfect, glorious charge had turned into a slaughter. He saw his men dying all around him, their bodies twitching in the dust. That's when Hayes and Billy opened their own doors. They rose from the creek bed, behind the main body of the Comanche, cutting off their only retreat. Their 2 revolvers added 10 more shots to the hurricane of lead. The noise was indescribable. It wasn't a battle. It was an industrial process. The sound of metal striking flesh, of bone shattering, of horses and men screaming in a symphony of death. The Comanche had no cover. They were trapped in a 30-yard wide shooting gallery. One of the drifters on the west rim, emboldened by the slaughter, stood up from behind his boulder to get a better shot. It was a mistake. A dying warrior, lying on the ground with a bullet in his belly, raised his bow and sent an arrow on its last flight. It took the drifter in the throat. He dropped his rifle, his hands clawing at the shaft, and toppled forward without a sound. Hayes saw it happen but didn't flinch. He was reloading, his fingers moving with practiced mechanical speed. Eject the empty cylinder, slam the new one in, cock the hammer. He was a part of the machine he had built. He saw Tall Elk, trying to rally the few men still on their horses. The young war chief was brave. He was screaming at his warriors, trying to get them to charge the east rim to break out of the kill box. But his men were deaf with terror. They were just trying to stay alive. Hayes raised his Colt. He sighted down the barrel at the magnificent eagle feather headdress. He saw the face of Broken Hand, the father who had betrayed his son to save him. He saw the impossible bargain that had been struck in the middle of the empty prairie. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Tall Elk's horse in the neck. The animal went down in a heap, pinning the young warrior's leg beneath it. The fighting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The echo of the last gunshot faded, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the buzzing of flies that were already gathering. 25 Comanche were dead. A handful of survivors were trying to crawl away, their bodies broken. Tall Elk lay trapped under his dead horse, his leg shattered. He had lost his headdress. He had lost his lance. He looked up and saw Hayes walking toward him through the carnage, a smoking revolver in his hand. The young warrior knew he was going to die. He began to chant his death song, his voice weak but defiant. Hayes stopped a few feet away. He looked down at the son of the man who had saved San Antonio. He saw the hatred in the boy's eyes, the unbroken pride. He saw a future of endless war, of sons paying for the sins of their fathers. He raised his pistol, the barrel pointed directly at Tall Elk's chest. The young warrior stopped chanting. He stared at the dark, round hole of the muzzle and waited. Hayes's finger tightened on the trigger. Chapter 20. Do it. The words came from Sam Walker, his voice a low growl from the rim of the draw. Finish it, Jack. He's seen all our faces. Hayes's finger was white on the trigger. The barrel of his Colt didn't waver. He looked down at Tall Elk, at the defiant hatred burning in the young warrior's eyes. He saw the death song waiting on his lips. Killing him would be as easy as breathing. It would be justice for the farmer and his family, for the dead drifter, for Cates and Pierce and all the others. He lowered the hammer with his thumb, the click soft and final. He holstered the revolver. No, Hayes said. Walker stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. No. Jack, what the hell are you thinking? He'll come back with 100 more, just like him. His leg is shattered, Hayes said, his voice flat. He's not riding anywhere. He looked down at Tall Elk. Your father bought you your life. Don't waste it. He turned his back on the wounded warrior and walked away, the crunch of his boots on the gravel the only sound in the suddenly silent canyon. He didn't need to see the look on Tall Elk's face, the mixture of confusion, shame, and fury. He didn't care. He had kept his end of a bargain that no one else understood. It was a cold piece of business, nothing more. "Billy," Hayes called out, "round up their ponies. Take the best ones. We'll need fresh mounts." The aftermath was a grim, methodical chore. They were no longer soldiers, they were butchers and thieves. They moved through the dead, collecting rifles, powder horns, and knives. The two remaining new men, the farmer and the other drifter, moved with the jerky, wide-eyed motions of men who had seen the face of God and found it was a monster. They avoided looking at the bodies. Walker, his face set in a grim mask of disapproval, directed the grim work. "Miller, check the dead for water. Don't touch their medicine bags. Bad luck." He walked over to where the drifter lay with the arrow in his throat. He pulled the arrow free with a wet sucking sound and tossed it aside. "Didn't even know his last name," Walker muttered. Hayes ignored them all. He was focused on a different kind of math. 30 warriors dead or dying. 1 ranger lost. It was a victory by any measure. But it was a victory that had cost them hours. Hours that Buffalo Hump was using to ride, to close the distance to San Antonio. Billy brought him a Comanche pony, a tough, wiry buckskin that looked like it could run forever. "We've got 20 fresh mounts," Billy said, "and enough captured rifles to arm a company." "We're not a company," Hayes said, swinging into the saddle. The movement sent a jolt of fire up his wounded leg. He gritted his teeth against it. "We're what's left." He looked at his men, their faces smeared with gunpowder, their eyes hollow. "We ride. Now. We don't stop until we see the mission walls." They rode out of that canyon of ghosts, leaving the dead to the sun and the buzzards. They left Tall Elk under his dead horse, a problem for his father to solve. They pushed the captured ponies hard, driving them east, a small, desperate army racing against the clock. The prairie fire they had set had burned itself out, leaving behind a vast black scar on the land. The air smelled of ash and cooling earth. They rode through the blackness, a grim procession under a sky that was turning from the bruised purple of dusk to the hard, star-dusted black of night. There was no talk. There was only the sound of hooves, the creak of leather, and the ragged breathing of tired men and exhausted horses. Hayes pushed them relentlessly. When a horse faltered, they left it and jumped onto one of the Comanche ponies. They were running on hate and bad coffee, and the certain knowledge that they were already too late. Sometime after midnight, Walker rode up beside him. "They know," he said, his voice low. Hayes didn't have to ask who they were. He could feel it too. A change in the air. A watchfulness. They were in Buffalo Hump's territory now. Every shadow could hold a scout. Every rock outcropping could hide an ambush. "He's letting us pass," Hayes said. "He wants us to see it. He wants us to be there for the end." It was a war of the mind now. Buffalo Hump wasn't just trying to win a battle. He was trying to break them, to grind their souls into dust before the first shot was even fired. Dawn found them on a high ridge overlooking the San Antonio Valley. The sun rose behind them, casting their long shadows toward the town. And they saw it. It wasn't a raiding party. It was an army. A city of lodges and campfires that stretched for a mile along the creek. Hundreds of warriors. A sea of horses that blackened the prairie. And in the center of it all, like a stone island in a raging river, stood the Alamo. The old mission. Even from this distance, they could see the movement. Warriors swarming over the low outer walls, taking up positions, fortifying the church, the barracks. They weren't preparing to attack it. They already owned it. Jesus Christ, the farmer whispered, his voice cracking. He took the whole damn town. Hayes pulled out his spyglass. He focused on the mission walls. He saw the flash of color from war shields, the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. And he saw something else. On the highest point of the church, where a cross should have been, a Comanche lance had been planted, a single black eagle feather fluttering from its tip. A flag of conquest. He swept the spyglass across the surrounding plain. He saw the main gate of the mission, barred and barricaded from the inside. He saw puffs of smoke from the walls, rifle fire. Not a lot. Sporadic. Potshots. The defenders were saving their ammunition. They were saving it for the final assault. Nora was in there. Billy's sister, with a handful of old men and frightened women, holding a fortress against an army, because he had told her to. He collapsed the spyglass. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, heavier than any gun. He had won his clever battle at Walker's Creek. He had outthought the decoy party, and in doing so, he had walked straight into the real trap. He had sacrificed the queen to take a pawn. He looked at his 6 remaining men. They were staring at the scene below, their faces pale, their bravado gone, replaced by a quiet, soul-deep despair. They were 7 men against 300. Hayes drew his Colt. The familiar weight in his hand was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into an impossible nightmare. He cocked the hammer. The sound was small, insignificant against the vast, waiting silence of the valley. Chapter 21. So that's it then. Sam Walker's voice was a dead flat thing. We sit up here and watch the show. No one answered. The 7 of them lay on the ridge, the rising sun warming their backs, and stared down at the end of the world. The Comanche encampment was a living thing, a sprawling city of hide and horses that breathed smoke and the low thrum of menace. And in its heart, the Alamo stood silent, a stone tomb waiting for its occupants to die. He played you, Jack, Walker said, not with accusation, but with the weary finality of a man stating a fact. He played you like a fiddle. Sent you chasing 30 braves while he took the whole damn pot. Hayes kept the spyglass to his eye. He wasn't looking at the army. He was looking at the mission walls. He saw a puff of smoke from a parapet, a tiny flicker of defiance. A single shot. A moment later, the faint crack reached them. Someone in there was still fighting. Someone was still alive. Nora. She's in there because of me, Billy Vance said, his voice raw. He had been staring at the mission for an hour without blinking. You sent me to warn her. I led her right into the cage. I sent you, Hayes corrected, his voice a rasp. He lowered the spyglass. His failure was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. He had been so sure of his own cleverness. He had set a perfect trap at Walker's Creek and had never once considered that he was the one being trapped. The farmer, the one who'd lost his family, started to laugh. It was a high, unhinged sound that made the other men flinch. 7 of us, he giggled, tears streaming down his dusty cheeks. 7 of us against the whole damn Comanche nation. We're already dead. We just ain't laid down yet. Shut up, Walker growled. Hayes looked at the farmer, at the broken man laughing at the edge of the abyss. And in that madness, he saw the spark of an idea. An idea so insane, so suicidal, that it just might work. He's right, Hayes said. The men stared at him. The farmer's wild laughter died in his throat. We're dead, Hayes continued, his voice gaining a strange, cold energy. Buffalo Hump knows it. He's sitting down there right now, watching us. He's waiting for us to do something stupid. He's waiting for us to charge. He wants us to come at him across that open ground, a glorious, doomed charge, so his warriors can cut us to pieces." "So what are we gonna do?" Miller asked, his hand unconsciously rubbing his wounded leg. "Just ride away." "No," Hayes said. "We're going to do what he doesn't expect. We're going to do what a sane man wouldn't even consider." He looked at each of them, his eyes burning with a feverish light. "He's got us trapped on the outside. So we're going to get on the inside." Walker's one good eye widened. "Inside the Alamo? Jack, that's a mile of open ground. There are 300 warriors between us and that wall. We wouldn't get 50 yards. "Not in the daylight," Hayes said. "But tonight there's no moon." Inside the Alamo, the air was thick with the smell of fear and stale water. Nora stood on the west wall, a captured Comanche rifle in her hands. The barrel was hot. She had fired the shot Hayes had seen, a lucky round that had knocked a warrior off his horse at 400 yards. It was a small victory, but it had made the others cheer. Now they looked at her like she was some kind of saint. She just felt tired. Old Man Muller stood beside her, his face grim, his ancient flintlock steady in his hands. The raid, the loss of his son, had burned the bitterness out of him, leaving behind a hard, cold core of pure survival. "They're just sitting out there," he said. "Waiting." "They're waiting for Jack," Nora said. She knew it, as surely as she knew her own name. This whole elaborate siege wasn't for the town. It was for him. She had done what Billy had told her. She had bullied and threatened and begged, and she had gotten 20-odd people, mostly old men, women, and a handful of teenage boys, into the mission before the Comanche had closed the ring. They had the ammunition from the garrison, but they had too few guns to use it effectively. They had water from the old mission well, but it was already tasting of mud. They were living on borrowed time. A boy of about 15, armed with a pistol nearly as big as he was, ran up to her. "Ma'am," he panted. "They're forming up by the creek. Looks like they're getting ready." Nora looked out over the wall. A group of 50 warriors was mounting up, painting their faces, preparing for a probe, an attack to test the defenses. Her stomach tightened. The waiting was over. "Tell everyone to hold their fire until they're close," she ordered, her voice clear and steady. "Don't waste a single shot. Aim for the man, not the horse." She looked at Muller. He nodded once, a grim understanding passing between them. They were going to die here. But they were going to make it expensive. Buffalo Hump watched the party of warriors prepare for the assault. He felt a surge of pride. His plan was working perfectly. The Rangers were on the ridge, watching, helpless. They were seeing his power. They were feeling the jaws of the trap close. Kills in shadow came to his side. "The wolves are still on the hill," he said. "They do not move." "They will," Buffalo Hump said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "When they see us begin to kill their women, they will come. Their honor will demand it. They will charge, and we will slaughter them. Then we will finish the ones in the stone house. It will be a good day." He looked up at the ridge, where the 7 tiny figures stood silhouetted against the sky. He felt a moment of respect for his enemy. Diablo Jack had fought well. He had been a worthy opponent. But he had made the white man's mistake. He had believed his own legend. He thought his magic guns made him invincible. Today, he would learn that the land itself was the strongest magic. And this land belonged to the Comanche. Night fell like a black shroud. The Comanche assault had been beaten back, but it had cost the defenders precious ammunition and 2 more lives. The air was filled with the sound of their victory chants, the rhythmic beat of their drums a constant, unnerving heartbeat in the dark. On the ridge, Hayes and his men stripped for the final run. They left their horses, their saddlebags, everything but their weapons. Each man carried 2 revolvers, a knife, and as many extra cylinders as he could stuff into his pockets and belt. "We go in pairs," Hayes said, his voice a low whisper in the dark. "Walker, you're with me. Billy, you take Miller. The rest of you, stick together. We move fast, and we move quiet. If you run into a patrol, you don't shoot unless you have to. Use your knife. If one pair gets caught, the others keep going. The mission is all that matters." He looked at the 6 faces in the dark. He saw fear, but he also saw a grim, fatalistic resolve. They were dead men already. This was just the final act. "There's a weak spot on the south wall," he said. "An old irrigation ditch that runs right up to the base. It's our only chance." He drew his knife, the blade a dull gleam in the starlight. He didn't offer any words of encouragement. There was nothing left to say. He turned and slipped over the edge of the ridge, moving down into the darkness of the valley below. He didn't look back. He just moved forward, a ghost in the night, his knife in his hand, heading for the heart of the enemy army. Chapter 22. He's bleeding out. Billy Vance pointed to a dark, rust-colored stain on a limestone rock. "A lot of it. He can't be moving fast." "He's moving fast enough," Jack Hayes said. "He didn't dismount. He didn't need to." The trail was a mile wide and painted in blood. The great Comanche war party had shattered after the battle at the Alamo, splintering into a dozen smaller bands running for the safety of the high plains. But this trail was different. It was the trail of a single wounded animal, a lion dragging itself back to its lair to die. They had broken the siege. It was a miracle of gunpowder and desperation. The 7 of them, slipping through the Comanche lines like wraiths, had made it to the irrigation ditch. They had come over the south wall in the deepest dark of night, their knives silent and deadly. Their sudden appearance inside the fortress, the eruption of 35 fresh revolver shots from a new direction, had turned the tide. The Comanche, believing they were surrounded by a much larger force, had panicked. Their final great assault had faltered. By dawn they were gone, leaving behind a field of their dead and the smoldering ruins of their brief conquest. They had won. It had cost them the farmer and the other drifter. Now they were 5. And the war wasn't over. "We've been tracking him for 3 days, Sam Walker said, his voice a dry rasp. He rode with his reins in his one good hand, his broken arm a constant throbbing misery. "He's got to stop sometime." "He's stopped now," Hayes said. He pointed ahead. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible against the gray canvas of the sky, rose from a narrow, hidden canyon a mile ahead. It was a small fire. A fire for 1 or 2 men, not a war party. "That's it," Miller said, his voice tight with anticipation. He drew his Colt, checking the caps. They all did. It was a nervous tick, a prayer to the god of percussion. "We go in quiet," Hayes said, swinging down from his horse. "On foot. I don't want him hearing us coming." "What's to hear?" Walker grumbled. "We walk in, we shoot him, we go home." "No," Hayes said, his voice stopping them all cold. "Just me. You 4 stay here. You see anyone but me walk out of that canyon, you open fire." "Jack, that's insane," Billy protested. "He's not alone. He'll have guards." "He's a chief," Hayes said. "His pride is worth more than a dozen guards. He'll see me coming. He'll want to see me coming." He looked at them, his 5 remaining men, his posse of ghosts. "This isn't a battle. This is a conversation." He left them on the ridge, and walked toward the canyon alone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his own boots on the loose rock. He held his Colt loosely at his side, not drawn but ready. He felt the eyes on him long before he saw anyone. They were watching from the rocks, from the shadows. They let him pass. The camp was small, pathetic. A single hide lodge, a small fire burning down to coals. 2 old warriors, their faces like cracked leather, stood guard. They held lances, not rifles. They watched Hayes approach, and did not move to stop him. Buffalo Hump was sitting by the fire, his back against a saddle. His left side was a mass of bloody rags. A rifle ball from the Alamo walls had torn through his ribs, breaking 2 of them and shredding his lung. Every breath was a wet, rattling struggle. The great chief, the terror of the plains, was dying. He looked up as Hayes walked into the clearing. His eyes, sunk deep in his skull, still held the fire of an unquenchable hatred. "Diablo Jack," Buffalo Hump rasped, the words catching in his throat. "You have come to watch me die." "I've come to end a war," Hayes said. He stopped 10 feet away, making no move for his gun. The 2 old guards shifted, their knuckles white on their lances. "It is ended," Buffalo Hump said, a bloody froth on his lips. "You have won. The land is yours. For now." "It was never about the land," Hayes said. "Not for me. It was about my men. The ones you slaughtered on the Guadalupe." The chief gave a weak, rattling laugh. "They were soldiers. They came to kill my people. They died. That is the way of things." "The way of things has changed," Hayes said. He slowly drew his Colt, not to aim it but to hold it. He let the dying chief see it, the blued steel, the 5 waiting mouths in the cylinder. "This is the new way. This gun. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get scared. It doesn't care about honor or bravery. It just kills. You send 100 warriors against it, 100 warriors die. You send 1,000, 1,000 die." Buffalo Hump stared at the revolver. It was the weapon that had broken his army. It was the magic that had defeated his medicine. He saw not a gun, but the end of his world. The end of the buffalo. The end of the people. "You came to gloat," the chief wheezed. "I came to offer a truce," Hayes said. The 2 guards stared. Buffalo Hump's eyes widened in disbelief. "A truce?" he coughed, a spasm of pain shaking his body. "You have won. You hold the knife to my throat. And you talk of a truce?" "I'm tired of burying my friends," Hayes said, his voice quiet. "I figure you're tired of burying your sons." He thought of Broken Hand, of Tall Elk. "You keep your people north of the Llano. We keep ours to the south. No more raids. No more killing. The war is over." Buffalo Hump was silent for a long time, his breath a ragged, painful rhythm. He looked at the Colt in Hayes's hand, then at the man holding it. He saw no triumph in Hayes's eyes. He saw only a vast, soul-deep weariness that mirrored his own. "You are not a chief," Buffalo Hump finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "A chief would kill his enemy when he is weak. He would take his scalp and sing songs of his victory. You are a white man. You think a war can be ended with words on a piece of paper." "I think it can be ended with a bullet," Hayes countered. "I'm offering you the words instead." He stood there, waiting, the heavy revolver a cold weight in his hand. He was offering his enemy a choice. Live with a new world, or die with the old one. Buffalo Hump looked away, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fire. He had been born in a world of grass and sky and endless herds. He would die in a world of fences and farms and thundersticks that never tired. "Take your truce," the chief whispered, his eyes closing. "And leave me to my death." Hayes holstered his Colt. The deal was done. He had won. He felt nothing. He turned his back on the dying lion and walked out of the canyon, leaving the two old warriors to stand guard over the end of an age. Chapter 23. It smells different. Billy Vance said it from his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the San Antonio Plaza. It smells like sawdust. Better than smoke, Sam Walker answered. He shifted his broken arm in its sling, his face a roadmap of exhaustion. Jack Hayes didn't say anything. He just looked. The town he'd left a smoking ruin was being born again. The skeletons of burned-out buildings were being torn down or reframed with new, pale lumber that stood out against the old dark adobe. The sound of hammers was everywhere, a steady rhythmic pulse that was the opposite of a war drum. People moved through the plaza with purpose. They still looked over their shoulders. Their eyes still held the memory of fear, but they were building. They saw the 5 riders, the hard-faced men with too many guns, and they stopped. The hammering paused. A silence fell. They weren't staring with hatred anymore. It was something else. Resentment. A grudging respect. These were the men who had been on the ridge. These were the men who had come back. They look at you like you're Jesus Christ and the devil all rolled into one, Walker muttered. Hayes's gaze was fixed on one spot. The tavern. The canvas tarp was gone. A new facade of raw pine was half finished. 2 men were on the roof, nailing down shingles. And standing in the doorway, directing them with a pointed finger, was Nora. He had expected her to be gone. He had ridden back to San Antonio with the bitter taste of ash in his mouth, certain that the stagecoach ticket had been her final word. He had won the war and lost everything else. But she was here. He swung down from his horse, his wounded leg protesting with a dull, familiar fire. He handed the reins to Billy. See to the horses. He walked across the plaza. The silence followed him. The hammers did not start up again. Every eye was on him, the Diablo Jack who had faced down Buffalo Hump and lived. He didn't feel like a devil. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. Nora saw him coming. She didn't move. She just watched him cross the dusty ground, her face unreadable. The pistol was gone from her belt. Her hands were empty. She wore a simple blue dress, the one she'd worn the day he rode out. He stopped in front of her, in the shadow of the new wall. The smell of fresh-cut pine was sharp and clean. "You're still here," he said. The words were inadequate. "I'm a poor investment," she replied, her voice even. "The stagecoach line requires you to pay for your ticket in advance." He had no answer for that. He just stood there, a stranger in a town he had both saved and damned. "I met him," Hayes said finally. "Buffalo Hump. He's dying. The war is over." "Is it?" Nora looked past him, at the wide, empty prairie that stretched beyond the town. "There will be another chief. There will always be another chief. And he will always want what we have." She brought her gaze back to him. The coldness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a clarity that was somehow more frightening. "That's his war. It doesn't have to be yours. It's my job." "It's your excuse," she countered, her voice still quiet, still calm. "It's the reason you give yourself for sleeping with a gun under your pillow and burying your friends every other season." She reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was creased and worn, as if she had held it 1,000 times. A stagecoach ticket. "This leaves day after tomorrow," she said. "It goes to St. Louis. They have brick streets there. They have a police force. The only Indians you see are the ones in the Wild West shows, getting paid to lose." She held it out to him. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of fact. A borderline, drawn in the dust between two different worlds. "There are 2 tickets," she said. "One for me. One for a man who knows when he's won enough." He stared at the ticket in her hand. He saw the printed letters, the destination, St. Louis. It sounded like a foreign country. He thought of his remaining men. Walker with his one good arm. Miller with his permanent limp. Billy with his old man's eyes in a young man's face. They were rangers. They needed a captain. The frontier was still a wild, untamed thing. It needed men like him. Didn't it? He looked at Nora. At her steady hands, at the resolve in her eyes. She had fought her own war while he was gone. She had held the Alamo. She had faced down death and decided to build something in its place. He had only ever known how to tear things down. "Come with me, Jack," she said, her voice softening for the first time, a crack in the perfect hard facade. "Or stay here and die alone. Because I won't be here to watch it happen." He looked from the ticket to the Colt revolver on his hip. The gun felt heavy, a cold anchor pulling him down into a world of blood and dust. The ticket was flimsy, a piece of paper that weighed nothing. But it felt heavier than the gun. It was the weight of a life he'd never considered, a future he didn't know if he deserved. His hand moved, slow, deliberate. He reached out and took the ticket from her. The paper was warm from her touch. He stood there, in the middle of the rebuilding town, holding a piece of paper that was a map to a world he couldn't imagine, the choice a living, breathing thing in the palm of his hand. Chapter 24. The ticket was a flimsy scrap of paper in his palm. It felt heavier than his gun. Jack Hayes stood before Nora, in the shadow of her half-built tavern, the silence of the plaza a weight on his shoulders. He had taken the ticket. He hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He just stood there, a man caught between 2 worlds, one of them dying and the other not yet born. Nora didn't press him. She just watched him, her eyes clear and steady. She had made her stand. The next move was his. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not of agreement but of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, the ticket still clutched in his fist. He walked back toward his men, who were watching from beside their horses, their faces grim and questioning. "Jack," Sam Walker said, his one good eye narrowed. He saw the paper in Hayes's hand. He knew what it was. Hayes didn't answer. He walked past them, into the livery stable. The familiar smell of horse and leather and hay closed in around him. This was his world. This was the only church he'd ever known. He went to his horse, a tough army bay, and ran a hand down its neck. The animal was solid, real. It understood simple things, a firm hand, a bucket of oats, a long run. He leaned his forehead against the horse's warm flank, the ticket crinkling in his hand. He thought of St. Louis. Brick streets. He tried to picture it, but all he could see were canyons and dusty plains. He tried to imagine himself walking on those streets, a man with no gun on his hip, no enemy on the horizon. The image wouldn't form. It was like trying to imagine the far side of the moon. His men needed him. Walker was half crippled. Miller would never ride hard again. Billy was a killer, but he wasn't a leader. Not yet. And the frontier was still the frontier. Buffalo Hump was dying, but his hatred wasn't. It would fester. It would find a new host. There would always be another chief. Nora was right about that. His hand went to his gun belt. He unbuckled it, the familiar weight lifting from his hips. He laid the belt across a saddle, the leather worn smooth with use. He picked up the Colt. He had stolen this gun. He had killed with it. He had changed the world with it. He looked at his reflection in the blued steel of the barrel. He saw a stranger with haunted eyes and a face that had been old for a long time. He saw the man who had ordered a fire set on the prairie, who had led his men into a slaughter pen, who had stood over a dying chief and talked of truce when every instinct screamed for blood. He had won. There was no question about that. He had taken a new weapon and used it to break the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. He had proven that 5 shots were better than 1. He had given the Rangers, the whole of Texas, the tool they needed to survive. His war, the one that had started in the blood and dust of the Guadalupe River, was over. He had his vengeance. He had his proof. But the cost. He thought of the men he had buried. McCulloch, Rodriguez, Cates, Pierce, the drifters, whose names he never knew. He thought of the look on Tall Elk's face, the boy he had crippled and left for his father to find. He thought of Doyle, the traitor he had shot in the back without a trial. He had set out to become a weapon, and he had succeeded. The weapon had worked, but it had burned something out of him along the way. He looked at the Colt in his hand. It was just a machine, a collection of springs and levers and machined steel. It had no soul. It had no memory. All the ghosts belonged to him. What would happen if he stayed? He would lead more patrols. He would fight more battles. He would bury more friends. He would become a legend, Diablo Jack, the man who couldn't be killed until the day a lucky arrow or a stray bullet proved the legend wrong. He would die alone, his hand on his gun, and the world would keep on turning. The war would go on, but he would just be another ghost haunting the chaparral. He looked at the stagecoach ticket. It was a map to nowhere, a promise of nothing but a chance to become someone else. A man who built things instead of breaking them. A man who woke up next to a woman who smelled of coffee instead of gunpowder. He didn't know if he could be that man. He was afraid he had forgotten how. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could no longer be the man who held the gun. He had won his war. The only way to keep winning was to walk away from the battlefield. He slid the Colt back into its holster and buckled the gun belt. He walked out of the livery, back into the sunlight. Walker, Billy, and Miller were waiting for him. They saw the look on his face, and they knew. Hayes walked up to Sam Walker. He didn't say a word. He just unbuckled the gun belt again and held it out. Walker stared at it, his one good eye wide with 100 unspoken questions. He looked at the Colt, the legendary weapon, the symbol of their survival. "Jack, you can't," he started. "You're the captain now, Sam," Hayes said, his voice quiet but firm. "You know the job. You know the men." Walker hesitated, then slowly, with his one good hand, he took the gun belt. The weight of it seemed to settle on him, a heavy mantle of responsibility. Hayes then turned to Billy Vance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled ticket. He tore it in half. He handed one half to Billy. "This one's for your sister," he said. He tucked the other half into his own shirt pocket. He looked at his men, his family, for the last time. "Don't get killed," he said. It was all he had left to give them. He turned his back on them, on the Rangers, on the war, on the legend of Diablo Jack. He walked across the dusty plaza, toward the half-finished tavern where Nora was waiting. His hips felt strangely light. His hands were empty. Chapter 25. Is it heavy? Nora's question was soft, barely a whisper above the creak of the stagecoach harness and the jingle of the bits. Jack Hayes looked down at the small carpet bag at his feet. It held his only other shirt, a razor, and the crumpled half of a ticket to St. Louis. "No," he said. "It's the lightest I've traveled in 10 years." The stagecoach driver, a whip-thin man with a tobacco-stained beard, cracked his long whip over the heads of the four-horse team. "Hiya. Get on." The coach lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels biting into the dusty street. Hayes didn't look back. He had already said his goodbyes. A silent nod to Sam Walker, who stood with the weight of a captain's badge and a stolen Colt settling onto his shoulders. A firm handshake with Miller, who would walk with a limp for the rest of his days but would walk nonetheless. A long, steady look from Billy Vance, who seemed to have aged a decade for every man they'd buried. They were Rangers. They would hold the line. It just wasn't his line anymore. Nora sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the last adobe buildings of San Antonio slide past the window, her face calm. She had left her half-built tavern in Billy's care, a down payment on a future she had decided to claim for herself. The coach cleared the town and picked up speed, rolling east across the open prairie. The land was green here, lush with late summer grass, a world away from the baked blood-soaked earth of the chaparral. The air smelled of clover and damp soil. For a long time they rode in silence, the rhythmic rocking of the coach a lulling counterpoint to the thunder of the hooves. "What will you do there?" Nora asked finally, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. "In a city with brick streets." Hayes thought about it. He had no trade but the gun. He had no skill but the tracking of men. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'll learn how to build things." He looked at her, at the strength in her profile, the quiet resolve. "Maybe I'll just learn how to be quiet for a while." She reached out and took his hand. His was calloused and scarred, a map of old fights. Hers was rough, from hauling lumber and cleaning guns, but it was warm. It was real. "Being quiet sounds like a good start," she said. Miles to the west, in a hidden canyon where the ghosts of old battles whispered on the wind, another kind of building was taking place. Broken Hand stood before a platform of freshly cut pine and cottonwood logs. Upon it lay the body of Buffalo Hump. The great chief had been washed and dressed in his finest buckskin, his face painted for his final journey to the spirit world. His war shield was on his chest. His lance was by his side. But the Colt revolver, the devil gun that had broken him, was nowhere to be seen. Tall Elk, his leg bound in a crude splint, directed the work from the ground where he sat. His voice was no longer that of a proud young warrior, but of an old man, filled with the ashes of defeat. He had been brought back by his father, a crippled son rescued by a traitor. He was a living symbol of their ruin. The remaining warriors, the survivors of the great shattered army, worked in a grim, ritualistic silence. They were not preparing for a raid. They were not painting their faces for war. They were building a fire to consume a chief and an age. They piled dry wood around the base of the platform. They brought forth the chief's war pony, its mane and tail braided with eagle feathers. A single, swift blow from a stone club, and the pony fell, its spirit freed to carry its master across the sky. They laid the dead horse at the foot of the pyre. As the sun began to touch the western horizon, Broken Hand took a torch from the central fire. He walked to the pyre. He looked at the face of the chief he had both loved and betrayed. He thought of his son, who would never ride again. He thought of the endless plains that would soon be crossed with fences. He thought of the coming darkness. He touched the torch to the dry wood. The flames caught slowly at first, then with a hungry roar they climbed the pyre, reaching for the still figure of the chief. The fire consumed the wood, the hide, the flesh. It sent a column of thick, greasy smoke into the twilight sky, a signal that could be seen for 100 miles. It was not a signal of war. It was a funeral notice. The stagecoach crested a low rise. The sun was a molten orange ball, sinking below the edge of the world, painting the clouds in shades of fire and blood. Hayes looked back to the west. He had been looking back all day, a habit he couldn't break. Against the vibrant, impossible colors of the sunset, he saw it. A thin, dark line rising from the distant horizon. A smudge of smoke where there should have been none. He knew what it was. He didn't know the details, but he knew the meaning. It was the end of something. The final punctuation mark on the last page of a long and brutal story. Nora followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked. "What do you see?" He watched the smoke for a long moment. A dark finger pointing to the heavens, a final goodbye from a world he was leaving behind. He felt a phantom weight on his hip, the ghost of a gun that was no longer his to carry. He turned away from the window and looked at her. He took her hand in his, the stagecoach rocking them onward into the east, into the coming night. "Nothing," he said. "Just the sunset. The West would never be the same. And neither would they." The end.